A nation begins. George Washington did not seek the glow of leadership. He was not drawn by ambition, but by a steady sense of duty. In the quiet landscapes of Virginia, he lived a life of land, routine, and reflection. Yet, when the call came, it was his name the people trusted most. It wasn't his voice that commanded respect, it was his silence. A silence filled with resolve. He stepped forward, not with excitement, but with the weight of understanding what was at stake during the Revolution. He was not always the most brilliant strategist, but he was reliable, steady, composed. His soldiers followed him not because he inspired them with fiery speeches, but because he stayed when others might have fled. He endured long winters, short supplies, and immense pressure with the same quiet eyes. Washington didn't crave command, but he carried it with calm. It was this refusal to chase power that made him powerful. When the war ended, many feared that a strong man might seize control, a new king, by another name. But Washington did something rare. He gave up his power. He stepped down. The world watched, stunned, as a victorious general returned home instead of clinging to control. It was a moment that told the world this new country might be something different. His reluctance was not weakness. It was wisdom. Washington understood that true strength isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It listens. It waits. It considers. And when he was asked again this time to become the nation's first president, he didn't leap. He paused. He reflected. Then, with the same sense of steady duty, he said yes. He became the first president, not because he desired it, but because the people believed in his character. In a time of revolution and uncertainty, Washington was the still center, the one man whose very presence made the idea of a new nation feel less like a dream and more like a future, holding the country together. Once in office, Washington's challenge wasn't to lead with bold moves, but to hold the fragile Union together. The country was a patchwork of colonies turned states, each with its own identity and suspicion of central power. The Constitution was young. The people were wary. And the world was watching. Washington led like a man walking across ice. Every step mattered. Every move echoed. He was careful in how he spoke, whom he trusted, and how he represented the presidency. His job wasn't just to govern it, was to prove that governance itself could work. He surrounded himself with strong, sometimes opposing voices. Hamilton and Jefferson sat at the same table, often disagreeing. But Washington welcomed the contrast. He understood that unity didn't mean silence, it meant respect. His cabinet was not just a group of advisors. It was a reflection of a country trying to figure itself out. In moments of unrest like the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington didn't hide. He led troops himself to show that law would be upheld, but not abused. He showed strength without cruelty, leadership without tyranny. Through each crisis, he reminded the country the president was not above the people. He was their servant. Foreign policy brought its own trials. Europe was on fire with revolutions and wars. America, small and young, had to choose carefully. Washington's answer was neutrality, not out of fear, but out of foresight. The country needed peace more than pride. His calm refusal to take sides allowed the republic to grow in safety under his steady hand. The government didn't just survive, it matured. Systems were tested. Laws were formed. Trust began to take root. And though the journey was difficult, Washington's ability to remain centered kept the entire experiment from collapsing. Through patience, presence, and principle, Washington held together a country that had never been one before. He didn't just lead it. He taught it how to exist, inventing The presidency. There was no manual for being the first president. No script. No traditions. George Washington had to invent the role day by day, aware that every decision would set a precedent. Every silence would become a statement. Every step would echo into the future. He believed in restraint. In an age where leaders often sought glory, Washington chose dignity. He declined regal titles, settling instead for the simple, Mr. President. It was a small decision with large meaning. He understood that democracy depended on the appearance and reality of equality. He wore plain clothes, held formal receptions, walked with care. Every action was measured to prevent the presidency from becoming a throne. He believed power must be respected, but never worshipped. He shaped the presidency not as a path to personal gain, but as a place of temporary service. He also respected boundaries. He didn't seek to dominate Congress or control the courts. He believed in separation and balance. He refused to run for a third term, fearing that staying too long would look too much like monarchy. In doing so, he defined not just how to lead, but how to stop leading. The State of the Union became a ritual under him. So did the peaceful transition of power. His calm demeanor gave shape to a role that could easily have slipped into danger. In choosing restraint, Washington gave future presidents something priceless, a model of leadership without ego. He showed that the president is not the nation. The people are. And that sacred understanding shaped every corner of the office. He built his final farewell. When Washington chose to leave office, the country held its breath. He had guided them through war, peace, and uncertainty. Many wondered if America could survive without him. But Washington knew that stepping down was as important as stepping up. In his farewell address, he offered not a victory speech, but a gentle warning. He spoke of unity, of resisting the pull of political parties, of staying out of foreign entanglements. He saw storms ahead: division, ambition, and the danger of forgetting what they had built. He didn't point fingers. He didn't make demands. He simply asked the nation to remember its shared purpose, to value peace over pride, to place country above personal gain. His words were not dramatic, they were deliberate. A quiet reminder from a man who had carried the nation on his shoulders. His decision to walk away was radical. Leaders rarely give up power freely. But Washington believed the presidency belonged to the people, not the man who held it. And in stepping down, he elevated the very idea of democracy. He returned to Mount Vernon, his beloved home, not as a ruler in retreat, but as a citizen fulfilled. He planted, read, hosted guests, and watched from a distance the country he had helped bring into the world. His farewell wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A moment that proved the strength of a republic rests not in force, but in faith, a quiet kind of greatness. Washington's greatness was not built on ambition or brilliance. It was built on character, on knowing when to act and when not. 2. On understanding that true power often comes from restraint. He was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. He did not chase popularity. He earned respect. In a time of loud revolutions and louder egos, he offered something rare: humility. He made mistakes. He held views shaped by his time. He was not perfect, but he never claimed to be. His strength was not in being flawless, it was in striving to be fair. He asked more of himself than he did of others. And that quiet discipline left a lasting impression. He believed in the long view, that the country was more important than the man, that decisions should be made with care, not speed, that integrity matters even when no one is watching. His face is on the dollar. on monuments, on mountains, but his real legacy lives in the shape of the presidency, in the peaceful transfer of power, in the idea that leadership is service, not status. George Washington didn't just lead a revolution. He led by example. And in doing so, he gave the world a new kind of greatness, one that whispers rather than shouts. The voice of Principal John Adams. John Adams didn't have the charisma of his peers. He wasn't tall like Washington or poetic like Jefferson. His voice could grate, his temper could flash, and his manner was often awkward. But beneath the powdered wig and stern expression burned a fierce intelligence and an unshakable moral compass. He wasn't there to be liked, he was there to do what was right. Adams had been one of the first to call for independence. Long before the war began, his voice rang with urgency. He wasn't a crowd pleaser, but a truth teller. At the Continental Congress, he pushed, argued, and persisted. He knew that freedom required clarity and courage. And while others hesitated, Adams stood firm. He was a thinker. He read widely, wrote endlessly, and debated fiercely. He believed in law and order, and in the idea that governments must serve justice. He helped draft the Massachusetts Constitution, which would inspire the federal one. He was always looking ahead, imagining a system that could outlast kings and mobs alike. Adams wasn't smooth, but he was solid. And when the new nation needed its first ambassador to Britain, they sent him. He faced old enemies with grace and steadiness, building a bridge where only ashes remained. Though his words weren't soft, his intentions were sincere. Even his critics had to admit, John Adams always meant what he said behind his formalities. And his short temper was a man deeply devoted to principle. He didn't chase glory. He didn't flatter crowds. He simply believed that truth, in the end, would do its own work. Defending peace over pride, as president, Adams faced pressure from every side. France and Britain were locked in conflict, and both expected America to choose a side. Many in Congress pushed for war. The people, stirred by national pride and anger, demanded retaliation. But Adams chose peace. It was not an easy choice. Choosing peace is rarely dramatic. It does not stir songs or statues. But Adams believed war should always be the last resort. He sent envoys to France, absorbing public criticism and political backlash. The effort became known as the XYZ Affair, a scandal at first, but one that revealed Adams's quiet patience. His goal wasn't weakness, it was survival. The nation was young, its military unprepared. A war with France could have shattered everything they'd built. Adams knew this. He stayed firm while others shouted. He waited while others plotted. And in time, diplomacy prevailed. A fragile agreement was reached, and war was avoided, but peace cost him politically. Federalists in his own party turned on him. They wanted a show of strength, and Adams had chosen calm instead. He knew it would hurt his chances for re-election. But he did it anyway. His decision proved that real courage isn't found in raising arms, but in lowering them. He believed that to lead was not to chase applause, but to carry responsibility. Even if it meant walking alone, Adams stood for restraint, even in the face of rage. And in doing so, he preserved a nation not yet ready for another war, a president without a party. John Adams was elected as a Federalist, but he never fit neatly into his party's box. He valued independence too much. Even as president, he refused to become a tool for factions or followers. This independence, though admirable, left him isolated. He often disagreed with his own allies. Alexander Hamilton, a powerful Federalist leader, saw Adams as unpredictable and stubborn. Their rivalry split the party. Adams distrusted political games. He believed in policy, not popularity. That belief, while noble, made him difficult to support. Adams also inherited a divided country. Political parties were new and quickly turning. Bitter. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans fought fiercely. Adams tried to rise above it. He didn't play to the crowd. He didn't flatter either side. Instead, he spoke with the same honesty that had always defined him, but honesty is not always welcome in politics. His Alien and Sedition Acts, meant to protect national security, were seen by many as an attack on free speech. The backlash was swift and loud. Though Adams believed the measures were temporary and necessary, they stained his presidency even. Jefferson, his old friend turned rival, ran against him with growing momentum. The election of 1800 was bitter and brutal. Adams, true to form, did not fight dirty. He walked his path proud, quiet, and alone. When he lost, he left Washington before dawn, refusing ceremony or drama. Adams was a president without a party, and in many ways a leader ahead of his time. He believed in conscience over convenience. And while it cost him politically, it preserved the soul of the presidency, legacy of law and liberty. Though his presidency was troubled, John Adams's legacy runs deeper than elections. He helped lay the intellectual and legal groundwork for the Republic. His belief in balance between branches, between freedoms and responsibilities, shaped America's institutions. Adams believed in law above all. He feared unchecked power, whether it came from a king or a crowd. He trusted in structure, in accountability, in reason. He believed liberty required not just passion but protection. Long before he became president, he had defended British soldiers in court after the Boston Massacre. It was an unpopular choice, but a principled one. He believed every person deserved a fair trial. Justice, he argued, must not depend on emotions. It must live in law. That moment foreshadowed his entire career. Again and again, Adams stood where others would not, choosing the hard right over the easy applause. He wasn't always correct, but he was consistent. He also passed his values on. His son, John Quincy Adams, would become the sixth president. Like his father, he served not for fame but for duty. Over time, Adams's work, his writings, his reforms, his risks became more appreciated. He didn't build monuments, but he built systems. He built ideals. He helped shape the kind of country that could argue, adapt, and endure. In the quiet corners of law and liberty, John Adams left fingerprints that still remain, the longest conversation after their political battles faded. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson found their way back to friendship. They began a letter exchange, thoughtful, warm, and reflective. Two aging revolutionaries, once rivals, now writing as old friends, they talked about the past, about books, about government, about the strange, beautiful country they had helped to create. Their letters were not just conversation, they were a living history, full of wisdom and humility. They spoke of mistakes and victories, of ideals and human failings. Their words reveal not only what they believed, but who they had become. Two men, aged and weathered, still dreaming of a better world. Their final years were marked by peace. Adams, back in Quincy, Massachusetts, lived simply. He wrote, and he waited. Jefferson in Monticello did the same. Across miles, they shared their thoughts as if still sitting side by side in Philadelphia on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Both men died. Adams's final words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives, not knowing Jefferson had passed just hours before dot. Tea was a fitting end to their long journey. Two men, forever linked by revolution, by principle, and by time. Their friendship had survived politics, and their final day became a symbol of unity. The longest conversation between Adams and Jefferson now lives on in letters, quiet testaments to endurance, reflection, and the gentle strength of reconciliation. The philosopher President Thomas Jefferson, in the summer of 1776, Thomas Jefferson sat quietly in Philadelphia with a quill in hand and a nation unborn in his mind. He was just 33, a soft-spoken man with sharp ideas, chosen not for power, but for poetry. He had a gift for words, and that gift would give voice to a revolution. He drafted the Declaration of Independence in a rented room, his windows open to the noise of a restless city. Outside, carts rolled over cobblestone, and tempers flared in taverns. Inside, Jefferson crafted sentences that would one day echo around the world. All men are created equal, he wrote. Simple, bold, immense. It was a phrase that defied kings and dared the future. He condemned tyranny and honored the right to pursue happiness. He gave form to the feelings of a people who no longer wished to be ruled from afar. The words were edited, debated, trimmed, but the heart of the document remained his. He had captured something eternal in the temporary, a declaration not just of separation, but of identity. Jefferson's pen made him a revolutionary, though he wielded no sword. He preferred ink to fire, thought to command. His talent wasn't in commanding troops, but in inspiring souls. That document, shaped in a rented room, still breathes in every courtroom, protest, and quiet vote. In writing the Declaration, Jefferson offered the world more than rebellion. He offered an idea that liberty belonged to all, not just the few. Even if that idea would take centuries to reach everyone's hands, farmer, thinker, founder Jefferson's heart belonged to the land. He called himself a farmer before anything else. At Monticello, his home in Virginia, he designed gardens, watched the sun move over his fields, and recorded the smallest details of weather and harvest. In the soil he saw harmony, but Jefferson was also a restless mind. He read constantly, wrote letters endlessly, and built inventions for quiet amusement. He believed that reason was a gift, and that a republic needed thinkers as much as fighters. He founded the University of Virginia because he believed knowledge should belong to the people. Education, he said, was the key to freedom. A democracy could only survive if its citizens could read, think, and ask questions. He collected books from around the world. When the Library of Congress burned in the War of 1812, Jefferson offered his personal collection to rebuild it. He saw no greater inheritance than knowledge passed down. As a founder, he brought idealism. He distrusted cities, bankers, and too much government power. He dreamed of a nation of small farmers, living freely and thinking boldly. It was a vision both beautiful and limited, shaped by a world that often clashed with it. Jefferson's mind was full of light, but even the brightest minds cast shadows. His ideals lifted many, but did not reach everyone. Still, he dreamed of a republic rooted in wisdom and planted seeds that still grow. The Louisiana Gamble. As president, Jefferson faced a choice. That would define more than a term. It would define the shape of the country. In 1803, he learned that France might sell a vast piece of land, the Louisiana Territory. It stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rockies, and it could double the size of the United States. Jefferson believed in a small, limited federal government. The Constitution, he thought, did not clearly allow the president to buy land. But the opportunity was too great, and the future was too vast to ignore. for $15 million. He bought it. No war, no blood, just a quiet deal that changed the map. It was called the Louisiana Purchase, and it would change the course of American history. With one signature, the young republic became a continental power. New rivers to navigate, new mountains to climb, new borders to imagine. Jefferson had acted boldly and against his own cautious principles. He sent Lewis and Clark to explore it. Their journey became legendary, full of rivers, forests, tribes, and unknown wonders. Jefferson watched from Monticello, curious and hopeful. The Louisiana Purchase showed that Jefferson's mind could stretch. That vision sometimes matters more than consistency. He made a gamble, and the country grew into the space he dared to claim. In that quiet act of expansion, Jefferson revealed something deeper, that even philosophers must sometimes act, and that the future doesn't always fit neatly into the past. Shadows and Monticello, for all his brilliance and idealism, Jefferson's life was filled with contradictions. He wrote that all men were created equal, yet held others in bondage. At Monticello, enslaved people worked the fields and served the house of the man who praised liberty. He knew it. He struggled with it. But he did not change it. Jefferson lived in a world where slavery was law, tradition, and economy. But that doesn't erase the tension in his beliefs. He spoke against slavery in theory, but participated in it in practice. He freed very few. He benefited greatly. Historians have studied his letters, his actions, his silences. There is no easy answer, only complexity. Jefferson's public ideals clashed with his private life, and the man who helped birth freedom also helped bind others. His relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello, remains part of that shadow. She bore his children, and yet she remained property in a system he never dismantled. Monticello stands today not just as a symbol of genius, but as a reminder that greatness is never simple, that even noble dreams can be built on uneven ground. Jefferson's contradictions don't erase his contributions, but they do ask us to look closer, to see the full picture, to hold both admiration and honesty in our hands, because to understand history is not to smooth it, but to sit with its weight. The Constitution's guardian, James Madison. Before James Madison ever held a title, he held a pen. In the quiet rooms of Philadelphia, he listened, thought, and wrote not loudly but deliberately. He was small in stature, soft in voice. But when he put ideas on paper, they carried the weight of nations. Madison believed that liberty needed structure, that freedom to endure had to live within clear boundaries. It wasn't enough to break away from a king. They had to build something better, something lasting. He arrived at the Constitutional Convention with notes, questions, and a vision. His ideas became the starting point for debate. He imagined 3 branches of government, each with power balanced by the others. He believed that no one person, no single group, should ever control too much. And though his draft would be revised and reshaped, Madison's framework endured. He took notes during every session. He watched how men spoke, how they hesitated, how they compromised. He didn't dominate the room, but he shaped it, quietly, with patience and persistence. Later, he helped write the Federalist Papers essays that explained the Constitution and persuaded the states to ratify it. His words made the complex understandable. His calm logic reassured a nervous people, and when the Constitution was finally adopted, Madison wasn't finished. He helped draft the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments that protected speech, faith, and individual freedom. He understood that the rules of government were not just about control, they were about promise. Madison didn't seek fame, but the rules he wrote shaped every presidency that followed. His pen became the quiet architect of a noisy republic, From ideas to action, James Madison went from theorist to leader, from the quiet corners of convention halls to the loud chambers of government. As a congressman, secretary of state, and then president, he brought his careful mind into the world of unpredictable action. In Congress, he helped draft laws and shape debate. As Jefferson's closest ally, he believed in a limited federal government and strong protections for civil liberties. But he also knew that ideas must be tested and adapted. When Jefferson became president, Madison became his Secretary of State. He managed foreign affairs, balanced difficult relationships with France and Britain, and learned the weight of diplomacy. He saw how fragile peace could be and how valuable careful decision-making truly was. Then, in 1809, Madison became the fourth President of the United States. He was reluctant but steady. He brought a scholar's calm to the presidency. His belief in balance and process shaped how he governed, but leadership meant compromise. It meant stepping into the unexpected. His presidency would soon be tested, not by theories, but by war. In office, he pushed for trade reforms and tried to navigate the pressure of European powers. He valued peace, but peace was slipping. The calm thinker now faced the chaos of conflict. The quiet student of law would soon become a wartime president. Madison's journey from philosopher to president was not dramatic. It was steady, thoughtful, and quietly courageous. He proved that ideas are not just written. They are lived. The War of 1812, the War of 1812 came slowly, then all at once. Britain had been interfering with American trade, seizing ships and pressing sailors into its navy. For years, Madison had tried to avoid conflict, but the pressure grew and war became inevitable. It was a different kind of war, not for independence, but for dignity, a second test of American sovereignty. Madison asked Congress to declare it, and they did. Not unanimously, not joyfully, but firmly. The war went badly at first. The military was small, the economy fragile. In 1814, British forces marched into Washington, D.C. and set fire to the Capitol and the White House. Madison had to flee the city, carrying with him only what he could. It was a low point, a humbling moment. But Madison didn't break. He returned. He reassured. He governed. As the war continued, American resilience grew. Naval victories lifted spirits. The defense of Fort McHenry inspired the writing of what would become the national anthem. And slowly, the tide turned. In 1815, peace was signed in the Treaty of Ghent. The war ended without a clear winner, but America had endured. It had defended its independence, even in defeat and fire. Madison had not been a wartime hero, but he had stayed. He had chosen steadiness over spectacle. And in doing so, he helped prove that the American experiment could survive more than one storm. The War of 1812 tested not just the country, but the Constitution itself. Madison, its author, had lived to see it strained, scorched, and still standing, the power of compromise, throughout his life. Madison believed in the quiet strength of compromise. He didn't see it as weakness, he saw it as wisdom. In a country built on difference, compromise was not surrender. It was survival. The Constitutional Convention. He watched opposing voices clash. He didn't silence them. He worked between them. Northern and southern states, large and small, all had to be heard. Madison believed that lasting solutions came not from domination, but from dialogue. As president, that belief guided him. He surrounded himself with thoughtful advisors. He welcomed disagreement. He understood that unity didn't mean agreement, it meant mutual respect. Even in the War of 1812, Madison sought negotiated peace. He believed in strength, but not for its own sake. He believed in law, but with humanity. His calm manner gave others space to speak. And in that space, compromise could live. After the war, Madison helped restore the economy. He supported a national bank, a shift from earlier views. But times had changed, and he was willing to adapt. He valued principle, but not rigidity. Madison's kind of leadership was rare. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand. It listened. It adjusted. It endured. In today's world, compromise is often dismissed. But Madison saw it differently. For him, it was the tool that built the Constitution and the thread that held the country together through trial and time. The legacy of liberty's architect, James Madison, died in 1836, nearly 50 years after he helped draft the Constitution. He had lived to see the country grow, struggle, and survive. And through it all, his quiet influence never faded. He never sought the spotlight. His name is not etched into great monuments or shouted in parades, but his ideas live in every page of law, in every vote cast, in every peaceful transfer of power. He believed in self-government, in education, in freedom rooted in structure. He warned of factionalism, of unchecked power, of forgetting the balance that liberty needs. His writings continue to guide courts and classrooms. His belief in the Bill of Rights protects every voice. His idea of separated powers still frames every presidency. Madison was a man of thought, and thought shaped nations. He trusted the people, but also believed they needed guidance. Not rules from a ruler, but from a system that served all. He retired to Montpelier, where he read, wrote, and reflected. He didn't seek to control the future, but he trusted that the rules he helped write would shape it. His legacy is not loud, but it is lasting. In the quiet pages of government, in the calm order of law, Madison remains a guardian, still watching over the country he helped build. The final founding flame, James Monroe. When James Monroe took the oath of office in 1817, the country was tired of conflict. The Revolution was decades behind. The War of 1812 had closed its final chapter, and for a time, peace felt real. This period would come to be called the era of good feelings, and Monroe stood at its quiet center. There were no fierce party battles, no loud national arguments, or so it seemed. The Federalist Party, once powerful, had faded, and Monroe, a Democratic Republican, ran almost unopposed for re-election. He traveled the country, shaking hands, listening, and reminding the people that unity was possible. But beneath the calm surface, tension stirred. Economic pressures, territorial disputes, and the ever-growing divide between North and South waited quietly in the background. The issue of slavery, in particular, was becoming harder to ignore. Still, Monroe projected stability. He did not provoke. He did not rush. He moved through the presidency like a gentle current, steady, subtle, and thoughtful. His manner calmed even his critics. Where others shouted, Monroe simply stayed the course. The nation, for a moment, felt whole. The flag flew high, the borders expanded, and the idea of being American began to deepen. Monroe may not have lit the fire, but he kept it burning evenly. For just a little longer, his era is remembered as peaceful, but it was a fragile peace, one built on hope and hesitation. Monroe didn't stop the future from arriving, but he gave the present a chance to breathe. Drawing the Western line in 1823, Monroe made a declaration that would define American foreign policy for generations. It was a message to Europe. The Americas were no longer open to colonization. Any attempt to do so would be seen as a threat. It became known as the Monroe Doctrine. The words were strong, but the tone was measured. Monroe wasn't calling for war, he was drawing a line. He believed that the Western Hemisphere should be free from the influence of old empires. America, still young, was standing up for its neighbors and for its future. This doctrine didn't come from ambition. It came from caution. Monroe saw what foreign powers might do. He remembered the Revolution, the war that followed, and the price of interference. He knew that protecting independence meant more than guarding borders. It meant guarding ideas. The doctrine wasn't just about Europe. It was about identity. It said to the world, America would no longer be a silent observer. It would watch. It would warn. It would defend the principles it had fought for. Behind the words stood Monroe. Calm, deliberate, and resolute. He wasn't loud. He wasn't boastful. But his message carried weight. The Monroe Doctrine didn't stop every conflict. But it sent a signal that America had grown, that the hemisphere had new rules, and that the quiet voice of a soft-spoken president could shape global understanding, expansion of borders and identity. During Monroe's presidency, the map of the United States began to stretch wider. New states joined the Union. Florida was acquired from Spain. And with every new border came new questions about land, about people, and about what kind of nation was forming. The Missouri Compromise was one of the most delicate moments of Monroe's time in office. Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, but that threatened the balance between free and slave states. Tensions rose. Debates sharpened. The peace of the good feelings era felt less certain. Monroe supported the compromise. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, but slavery would be banned in future territories north of a certain line. It wasn't a solution, it was a pause. A way to hold the Union together. Even as cracks formed, he didn't love the division, but he valued the Union. And in choosing compromise, Monroe revealed a truth, that holding the nation together sometimes meant making imperfect choices. Meanwhile, westward expansion continued. Settlers moved beyond the Mississippi. The country's shape changed rapidly. But with land came responsibility to govern, to include, to reckon. Monroe saw a country becoming larger, but also more complex. He understood that growth alone wasn't enough. Identity had to grow too. What did it mean to be American in a land so wide, so different, so divided? Under Monroe, the borders grew, but so did the burden of unity. And the soft peace of his presidency began to feel thinner with every step west. The man in the middle, James Monroe, was not the most famous founding father. He lacked Jefferson's poetry, Washington's presence, and Hamilton's fire. But in many ways, that made him perfect for the moment. He was a man in the middle between eras, between ideas, between identities. He had fought in the Revolutionary War, been wounded, and stood beside Washington at Valley Forge. He had served as a diplomat, a senator, and a governor. He had watched the country rise from colony to republic, and now he helped it step into its next chapter. He wasn't flashy, but he was steady. He didn't seek to transform the nation, he sought to hold it gently. His speeches were measured. His tone was calm. He moved through crises with a quiet dignity that reflected his belief in balance. He belonged to the past, but he faced the future. He carried memories of muskets and independence, but governed in a time of steamships and westward dreams. His leadership felt like a bridge not just between political parties, but between generations. In this middle space, Monroe found strength. He didn't need to dominate. He only needed to guide. And in doing so, he helped the country breathe. Between battles, between revolutions, between storms, James Monroe may not have lit the fireworks of change, but he lit the lanterns of continuity, and carried them through a dim and uncertain corridor in history, legacy of a bridge builder when Monroe left office in 1825. The country he handed over looked bigger, stronger, and more confident. But he knew better than most that strength could hide strain. He had seen the divisions. He had worked to patch them. And he hoped they would hold. He retired quietly, returning to Virginia with little wealth and no wish for more power. His health declined. His family suffered losses. And in time, Monroe faded from the public view, but his legacy did not fade. The Monroe Doctrine would become a cornerstone of foreign policy. His calm leadership would be remembered as a rare moment of unity. And his time in office would be studied not for what changed, but for what endured. He was the last president who had fought in the Revolution, the last who had walked with Washington. The final thread to the nation's earliest days, his death. In 1831, on July 4th, like Jefferson and Adams before him, marked more than the end of a life. It marked the closing of an era. The founding generation was gone. The next chapters would be written by new hands. In a different tone, Monroe's gift to the country wasn't bold change. It was quiet continuity. He gave space for the country to grow, time for it to prepare, and a model of calm leadership that still matters. In the soft light between storms, Monroe stood not to shout, but to steady, a bridge between what had been and what was coming. The diplomat's son, John Quincy Adams, was born in 1767, just 9 years before the Declaration of Independence. His cradle was rocked by revolution. His father, John Adams, would help birth a nation and young John. Quincy would grow up in its shadow, with history unfolding outside his window. He watched as war approached. He listened as arguments turned to action. At 10 years old, he traveled with his father to Europe, witnessing diplomacy before most children. New geography. While others played, he observed. While others dreamed, he studied. He learned languages. He read philosophy. He copied letters, translated texts, and absorbed the world around him. From the age of boyhood, he was being shaped for service. The revolution didn't just change the colonies, it crafted him. He wasn't loud, but he was sharp. He had his father's integrity and his mother's discipline. The young republic offered no guarantee of survival, and he understood that early. In his journals, he captured both hope and realism. He loved America, but never blindly. The child of independence would not be its loudest defender, but perhaps its most faithful. He was born into the first generation to carry freedom forward, and he took that burden seriously from the beginning. John Quincy Adams was marked not by ambition, but by purpose. A quiet resolve to live not for comfort, but for country. The scholar abroad, before becoming president, John Quincy Adams was already one of the most experienced diplomats in American history. He served overseas almost continuously from the age of 14 into his middle years, moving from courts of kings to tables of treaties. Always as a student of people and policy, he represented the United States in the Netherlands, Prussia, Russia, and England. At each post, he learned new customs, built relationships, and quietly proved that young America could stand with the old empires of Europe. He was not charismatic, but he was respected. His manner was serious, even cold at times, but always professional. He had little patience for charm without substance. He spoke the truth, even when it wasn't diplomatic. Yet nations listened. He helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. He helped define the borders of the United States in talks with Spain and Britain. He believed that peace was the greatest victory, not the spoils of battle, but the stability of agreement. In every capital, He carried the quiet dignity of a nation still forming its image. He didn't boast. He didn't provoke. He simply worked tireless, intelligent, and exact. More than any title, his life was defined by this global service. He saw the world and brought those lessons home, not to copy Europe, but to learn. How to lead differently. John Quincy Adams was not shaped by politics alone. He was shaped by distance, by culture, by the idea that a republic must be known not just for what it believes, but for how it behaves, a presidency of vision. When John Quincy Adams became the 6th President of the United States in 1825, he entered office with more experience than almost anyone before him. But experience, as he would learn, was not enough. He dreamed big. He wanted to build roads and canals that would link the nation. He believed in education and proposed the creation of a national university. He imagined a country connected not just by land, but by learning. His vision was rooted in public good, not politics. But politics was rising fast. The era of fierce partisanship was returning, and Adams was unprepared for its intensity. He refused to campaign. He avoided patronage. He believed the office should speak for itself, that refusal to play the game made enemies. Andrew Jackson, his former rival, gained support by calling Adams a elitist and out of touch. The press turned cold. Congress resisted. Still, Adams worked. He organized scientific surveys. He defended native land rights quietly, but with conviction. He planted ideas, knowing they might not bloom in his lifetime. His presidency was not a time of triumph, but of tension. His ideals were too advanced for a country not yet ready to meet them. His principles were firm, but his methods didn't charm Dodd in 1828. He lost re-election to Jackson. It was a bitter campaign. Adams, always dignified, accepted the result without complaint. Though his presidency lasted just one term, his vision lasted longer. Many of the ideas he proposed would be taken up in later decades. Roads, schools, progress through unity. He governed with his eyes on the horizon, and even when few followed, he kept walking forward, a voice against slavery after his presidency. John Quincy Adams did something no other former president had done. He returned to public service. In 1830, he was elected to the House of Representatives. He would serve there for the rest of his life. In Congress, Adams found his greatest calling fighting against the spread of slavery. He stood almost alone at times, challenging the gag rule that prevented slavery from even being discussed. Again and again, he spoke up, submitted petitions, and demanded debate. His voice was not always welcomed. He was mocked, scorned, even threatened. But he didn't stop. He believed slavery was not just a moral evil, it was a threat to the very idea of America. He argued not with anger, but with endurance. His words were measured, his presence persistent. He believed that silence was complicity, and that the Constitution should serve all, not just some. He defended Africans captured aboard the Amistad, helping them win their freedom before the Supreme Court. It was a rare moment of public praise, but Adams had not sought it. He saw it as duty. He was old by then, his hair white, his frame thin, but his spirit remained sharp. He was still reading, still writing, still showing up in the halls of Congress. His voice rang clearly. The fight for liberty was not over. It had only begun. He collapsed on the floor of the House in 1848, dying 2 days later. His last words were simple: "This is the end of earth. I am content." Even in death, he had served until the very last breath. John Quincy Adams never sought popularity. He sought principle. His life, from boyhood to old age, was devoted not to image but to impact. He believed in service. in truth, in law. He believed that a nation must be built not on convenience, but on character. And he tried, always, to live by that belief. He wasn't a warm politician. He rarely smiled in public. He struggled to connect with crowds. But his writing was powerful, his ideas deep, his focus unshaken even when forgotten by the people. He never forgot his purpose. He didn't retire into comfort. He didn't write memoirs for praise. He returned to the slow, steady shaping of a nation's soul. His example teaches something rare, that greatness is not always loud, that it doesn't always win votes, that a life of quiet purpose can leave ripples that last far beyond applause. In letters and speeches, he warned of division, of pride, of forgetting justice. He called America not to remember its power, but its promise. His father helped declare independence. He helped define what it should mean. John Quincy Adams lived a life few would envy, full of loneliness, burden, and opposition. But he lived it with clarity. He never lost sight of who he was or why he served, and in that quiet, unwavering commitment, he became one of the nation's most enduring examples of integrity. The people's President Andrew Jackson entered the world in 1767 on the rough edges of the Carolina frontier, a place defined by struggle and survival. His father died before he was born, and by the time he was 14, Jackson had lost his mother and brothers to war and disease. Raised in hardship, he grew into a man shaped by loss, defiance, and fierce self-reliance. During the Revolutionary War, he served as a courier boy for the militia. Captured by the British, he refused to polish an officer's boots and was struck across the face with a sword. The scar never faded, nor did the anger that followed. His hatred for the British and his mistrust of aristocratic power would live with him for the rest of his life. With little formal education, Jackson studied law on his own. He eventually became a lawyer, then a judge, and finally a general. But beneath the title was always the same spirit: rebellious, wounded, unyielding. He fought duels, carried grudges, and made no effort to hide his emotions. His rise wasn't smooth or polished. It was earned, clawed, and claimed. Jackson's youth did not prepare him for gentleness. It prepared him for war, both real and political. And from the start, he carried himself not like a diplomat, but like a defender. The frontier had taught him one rule above all others: survive, and never be owned. Champion of the common man, when Andrew Jackson ran for president, he did not sound like the others. He spoke not to the polished elite, but to the everyday worker, the settler, the farmer, the soldier. He called himself one of them, not above them. His image was built on grit. He wore his scars with pride. To many, he was living proof that power no longer belonged just to the wealthy or the well-connected. It could rise from a log cabin as easily as from a mansion. Jackson won the presidency in 1828 with overwhelming support from voters who had felt ignored by earlier administrations. He framed his election as a victory for democracy, a shift. From the educated few to the determined many, he extended voting rights to more white men by removing property requirements. He promised to return government to the people and to resist corruption from privileged insiders. To his supporters, he was a hero. To his critics, a dangerous populist, but Jackson's definition of the people was limited. He did not speak for women, indigenous tribes, or enslaved people. His populism had boundaries and beyond them. His compassion often faltered. Still, in the eyes of many Americans, Jackson symbolized empowerment. He made them believe that the presidency was not out of reach, that it could belong to someone. Like them, his appeal was emotional, direct, and bold. And in that emotional connection, Jackson transformed the presidency into something more than a role. He made it a personal bond between leader and citizen, the spoils of power Jackson's. Belief in loyalty ran deep. And once in office, he acted on it. He introduced a new practice, rewarding supporters with government jobs. It became known as the spoils system, and it reshaped how Washington worked. To Jackson, this wasn't corruption, it was justice. He believed that rotating office holders would prevent entrenched power, that the government should reflect the will of the people, and that included his people. He removed dozens of federal employees, replacing them with allies and loyalists. Critics accused him of politicizing the public service. Supporters said he was simply cleaning house. Jackson also confronted the Second Bank of the United States, which he saw as a symbol of elite privilege. He vetoed its recharter and moved federal funds into smaller state banks. This bold move earned praise from his base and fury from his opponents. To Jackson, the bank was more than a financial institution, it was a threat to the common citizen. He called it a monster and promised to break its power. He often made decisions quickly and forcefully. He used the presidential veto more than all previous presidents combined. He believed the executive branch should not bow to Congress, but stand equal to it. In many ways, Jackson redefined the presidency, turning it into a center of direct action and personal will. He trusted himself more than institutions, instincts more than process. He didn't ask for permission. He acted and made others catch up. The spoils system and the bank war revealed both Jackson's strength and his risk. He challenged old structures but built new ones on personal loyalty. He changed how presidents governed for better and for worse. The Trail of Tears, one of the darkest marks on Jackson's legacy, is his Indian removal policy. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, which forced Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States. He claimed it was necessary for progress, that moving tribes west of the Mississippi would prevent conflict and allow for peaceful settlement. But the reality was brutal. Thousands of Native Americans, including the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, were pushed from their homes. They were marched hundreds of miles under harsh conditions. Food was scarce. Shelter was minimal. Disease spread quickly. The Cherokee called their forced journey the Trail of Tears. Nearly 1 in 4 died before reaching the new territory. It was a sorrowful exodus, sanctioned by law and carried out under pressure. Some tribes resisted with petitions, with protest, even with war. But Jackson remained firm. He saw removal as policy, not persecution. He believed the United States had the right to expand, and that expansion must not be slowed even when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Cherokee sovereignty in Worcester v. Georgia. Jackson ignored it. He proceeded as planned. To him, this was not cruelty, it was governance. But to history, it remains a tragedy. Jackson's presidency lifted many, but it crushed others. And the Trail of Tears remains a silent shadow across his legacy, a reminder that strength, when untempered by empathy, can wound deeply. In that march westward, beneath heavy skies and broken hearts, the true cost of Jackson's policies became visible, not in speeches, but in silent suffering. The storm that changed the Capitol. Andrew Jackson left the presidency in 1837 after 2 terms, a storm behind him and a changed Washington in his wake. He returned to his Tennessee plantation, known as the Hermitage, where he would spend his final years. He had come to power with a promise to shake things up, and he had. He changed how campaigns were run, how power was used, and how the presidency was understood. He made it louder, closer, more personal. Jackson's influence extended far beyond his time in office. He created a new style of leadership, direct, emotional, unapologetic. Future presidents would follow his model, some with care, others with chaos. He had opened politics to the masses, but also deepened its divisions. He had fought for the people, but not all of them. He had expanded the country, but not without cost. Even in retirement, he remained a symbol. A hero to some, a tyrant to others. He was a man impossible to ignore. He died in 1845, surrounded by family, his legacy already debated. On his tombstone was carved a simple phrase, General Andrew Jackson. It was the title he cherished most to this day. His face appears on the $20 bill. His name marks counties, cities, and schools. And yet, his story carries contradiction, a blend of triumph and sorrow, progress and pain. Andrew Jackson didn't just pass through history. He struck it like thunder. His was not a gentle legacy, but it was a powerful one. One that forced America to confront what leadership means and what it sometimes costs. The forgotten mastermind Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren did not rise to power through the force of his voice or the fire of revolution. He built his influence behind closed doors, through patient conversation, careful strategy, and unwavering consistency. Where others fought with thunder, Van Buren moved like a current, quiet, steady, and deliberate. Born in Kinderhook, New York, in 1782, Van Buren grew up speaking Dutch as his first language. From modest beginnings, he observed how power worked not just in speeches, but in structure. He became a lawyer, then a legislator, and soon discovered his true skill, organizing. He helped build the first modern political machine in New York, turning alliances into results and votes into victories. He wasn't a fiery leader, but a shrewd one, always thinking 3 steps ahead. People called him the little magician, not for showmanship, but for skill. Van Buren believed that parties were not a problem in democracy, they were a solution. In a country growing larger and more diverse, parties gave people a place to belong. They created unity from difference, and he was determined to make them work. He helped elect Andrew Jackson and served as his most trusted advisor. While Jackson charged forward, Van Buren held the reins of organization. He managed campaigns, calmed divisions, and turned passion into policy. When Jackson's presidency ended, Van Buren inherited the mantle not with a roar, but with quiet confidence. He had built the road to power. Now he would walk it, a nation. In panic, Van Buren became president in 1837, stepping into office at a moment of calm, only to see the skies darken. Just months into his term, the nation faced a devastating economic collapse known as the Panic of 1837. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment soared. Families lost homes, savings, and stability. It was a storm without warning, and it swept across every state. The roots of the panic were deep speculative land bubbles, reckless lending, and Jackson's earlier decisions to dismantle the national bank had left the economy fragile. But now it was Van Buren who held the reins. He refused to respond with bold spending or intervention. Instead, he believed the government should stay disciplined, avoid deep debt, and let the economy recover naturally. It was a decision rooted in principle, but it made him a target. Critics called him cold, distant, unwilling to help. Bread riots broke out in cities. Farmers and workers demanded action. But Van Buren held firm, insisting that short-term relief should not weaken long-term responsibility. His calmness, once admired, now looked like aloofness. His belief in limited government clashed with a people desperate for aid. The panic defined his presidency. It wasn't of his making, but it became his burden. And as the nation suffered, the quiet man who had mastered politics found that no strategy could shield him from economic pain. Van Buren didn't flinch, but neither did he change. And in that stillness, his presidency slowly sank beneath. The weight of hardship, defender of process even in the storm, Van Buren never abandoned the belief that systems mattered more than spectacle. He trusted the process. He believed that order and structure could keep democracy safe even when it was unpopular to say so. He rejected the idea that the president should act on emotion or whim. He respected Congress. He honored the Constitution. He moved slowly, deliberately, with the law as his compass dot in a time when many cried out for bold gestures. Van Buren chose caution. He created the independent treasury system, a way for the government to store its funds without relying on private banks. It was a step toward stability, and though it didn't fix the panic, it laid the groundwork for better financial safeguards. He avoided military entanglements. He refused to annex Texas, fearing it would deepen the national divide over slavery. He made decisions not for applause, but for principle. Van Buren believed that democracy should not chase emotion, that it should be anchored in norms, in precedent, in quiet respect for the rules. He saw government not as a show, but as a responsibility. To many, his style felt too passive. But to Van Buren, restraint was strength. It protected the republic from rashness and from those who might abuse power for gain. He was not a warrior. He was a steward tending to the fragile mechanics of governance, while others sought to bend them. In a louder age, his quiet defense of order seemed outdated. But history would see in him a man who tried to keep democracy on its rails, even as others pulled it toward the edge. Principles before popularity. As the 1840 election approached, Van Buren's opponents seized their moment. They painted him as aristocratic, distant, and responsible for the nation's economic pain. The Whigs ran William Henry Harrison, a war hero, with slogans like log cabin and hard cider. It was one of the first truly modern campaigns, filled with rallies, songs, slogans, and spectacle. And Van Buren refused to match it. He did not hold rallies. He did not stir emotions. He stood by his policies, his principles, and his belief in quiet governance. He would not change to win. The result was decisive. Harrison won in a landslide. Van Buren left office with grace, never complaining, never blaming, but he didn't disappear. He continued to speak, write, and think deeply about the country's future. He opposed slavery's expansion. He ran again in 1848 under the Free Soil Party, taking a stand against the spread of human bondage, even knowing he would lose. To Van Buren, winning was not the only goal. Integrity mattered more. He did not bend to fashion or fear. He did not flatter crowds. He trusted that ideas, once planted, might bloom even after he was gone. He walked away from power with his values intact. In a world where many change, to keep their place, Van Buren remained steady. That steadiness cost him politically. But it gave him something rare, a life lived without regret, a career untouched by scandal, and a conscience clear of compromise. In choosing principle over popularity, Van Buren showed that greatness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and still leaves a mark. The gentleman forgotten in his final years, Martin Van Buren lived quietly in Kinderhook, surrounded by books, letters, and memory. The mansion he named Lindenwald was not a palace of power, but a place of reflection. He wrote his memoirs, walked the countryside, and watched the nation change. He had outlived many of his contemporaries. New faces filled the stage. New voices shouted over old ones. And slowly, Van Buren faded from the headlines. History, too, often passed him by. He wasn't remembered for victories. He wasn't linked to wars or great speeches. His contributions, though deep, were buried beneath louder names, but his legacy lived in structure, in the way parties worked, in the balance of the treasury, in the quiet trust between law and leadership. He had shaped the system, even if few remembered the architect. He died in 1862, during the Civil War, a conflict that broke the very balance he had spent his life preserving. He saw the cost of division, the danger of extremes, and the deep wounds that come when order fails, yet even then, his voice remained calm. He believed that the nation, even broken, could heal, that the system he helped build would hold. Martin Van Buren was never a towering statue in the national memory, but he was a quiet cornerstone, and sometimes it is the cornerstone that holds the most weight, even if no one stops to admire it. A presidency measured in weeks. William Henry Harrison was born into a world of politics, but it was the wilderness that made him famous. Born in 1773 in Virginia, he came from a wealthy and well-connected family. His father had signed the Declaration of Independence. Yet, William Henry's path would not be one of law books or long debates. It would unfold across battlefields and the far edges of the American frontier. He joined the Army in his late teens, stationed in what was then the Northwest Territory. The land was vast, untamed, and full of conflict. Native tribes resisted the spread of American settlers, and Harrison quickly found himself in the middle of a long, violent struggle. He became governor of the Indiana Territory and used that position to expand settlements through treaties, many of which were unfairly negotiated. He saw expansion as progress, but that vision came at the cost of displacement. His military reputation was cemented at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. It was a clash between American forces and a confederation of native tribes led by the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. The battle was brutal and messy, with no clear victor, but Harrison claimed it as a triumph. It became his identity, Old Tippecanoe. Later, he would serve in the War of 1812 and help secure victories against British and native forces. But it was always the frontier, the imagery of wilderness and war, that followed him. By the time he entered politics, he was seen less as a policymaker and more as a symbol, a man who had conquered the wild, a man who understood ordinary settlers, a man who wore the past like armor. He was remembered not for what he said, but for where he had stood with a sword on distant soil, the log cabin campaign in 1840. The Whig Party needed a candidate who could defeat Martin Van Buren. The country was still reeling from the economic collapse, and many voters blamed Van Buren for their hardship. The Whigs didn't want a philosopher or a policymaker. They wanted a face, a feeling, a symbol of hope. They chose William Henry Harrison. Though he was wealthy and educated, they crafted a new image for him, one of a simple man, living in a log cabin, sipping hard cider by the fire. It wasn't entirely true, but it didn't have to be. The symbol was stronger than the fact. The campaign became a spectacle. Rallies were filled with barrels of cider, songs, slogans, and parades. Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, became a chant heard across the nation. It was the first truly modern presidential campaign, not about deep ideas, but emotional connection. Harrison himself said little. He let the imagery do the work. He was cast as the man of the people, in contrast to the aristocratic Van Buren. It was political theater, and the country loved the show. The campaign drew in new voters, many of whom were voting for the first time. It energized young men, frontier settlers, and those eager for change. It turned politics into performance, and performance into power. Harrison won by a landslide, but beneath the celebration, something had shifted. Campaigns were no longer just debates, they were stories. Stories shaped by teams, tools, and tactics, and Harrison, whether he intended to or not, had become the prototype for the image-driven candidate, the longest speech, the shortest term on. March 4, 1841, William Henry Harrison stood before a massive crowd in Washington, D.C. to deliver his inaugural address. He was 68 years old, the oldest president ever elected at that time, and the day was cold, windy, and wet. He wore no coat. He carried no hat. He wanted to appear strong, and then, for nearly 2 hours, he spoke. His inaugural speech was the longest in American history, over 8,000 words. It was written in grand, formal style, dense with references to ancient history and political philosophy. He aimed to prove that he was more than just a frontier general, that he had intellect, depth, and vision, but the weather showed no mercy. And neither did fate. Shortly after the ceremony, Harrison developed a cold. Within days, it worsened. The White House had no proper heating, and the president's condition declined. His doctors tried bleeding him, a common treatment at the time, but it only made things worse. His illness turned into pneumonia. Fevers came, then weakness, then silence. On April 4th, just 31 days after taking office, William Henry Harrison died. He had served the shortest presidency in American history. The nation was stunned. No one had considered such a possibility. There were no clear instructions for what to do next. Would the vice president become acting president, or take full power? The Constitution did not say dot in that sudden void. The fragility of the system became visible. Harrison had spoken of legacy. But his real legacy would be the silence he left behind. A nation unprepared. Harrison's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a constitutional crisis in waiting. No president had ever died in office before. The founders had considered many things, but not this. The Constitution said the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the presidency. But it didn't say whether he became president outright. Vice President John Tyler insisted he was now president, not acting, not temporary. Just president. He took the oath, moved into the White House, and assumed full authority. Some questioned his decision. Many saw it as bold. Others feared it set a dangerous precedent. But Tyler refused to waver. In doing so, he established a principle that would hold for more than a century, that when a president dies, the vice president becomes president in full. It was an answer born from confusion and a decision that would shape every transfer of power to come. The briefness of Harrison's term also raised deeper questions. How fragile was the presidency? How prepared was the nation to face unexpected loss? How much did personality matter when the person was suddenly gone? The government had to move forward, but the memory lingered. Harrison's image remained on campaign posters, in homes, and in the songs that had once sung his name. His administration had barely begun. His promises remained unfulfilled, and the man who had symbolized victory was now a ghost of what might have been. Yet in the stillness that followed, the nation learned something. That stability required clarity. That systems must be prepared not just for success, but for the worst, and from Harrison's absence, a quiet foundation was laid. One built not on triumph, but on transition. The man without a party, John Tyler, never imagined he would become president. He had been chosen as William Henry Harrison's running mate, not for vision or popularity, but for balance, a Southern nod on a Northern ticket. A gesture more than a plan. He entered the vice presidency with little expectation and almost no power. But within a month, everything changed. Harrison died just 31 days into office, and suddenly, Tyler was faced with a question the Constitution had never clearly answered. Was he now president, or merely a caretaker. Debate followed. Some believed he should hold office temporarily. Others thought power should pass to Congress. Tyler made the decision himself. He took the presidential oath. He moved into the White House, and he declared that he was not acting president. He was the president. In doing so, he created a precedent that would shape the nation forever. His decision to assume full authority ensured a smooth line of succession in times of loss. It was bold, silent leadership in the face of ambiguity. Yet, while the nation moved forward, Tyler found that the title alone offered no safety. He stepped into the role with determination, but without a party, without a mandate, and without allies ready to defend his position. The presidency was his now. But so was the weight of standing alone in the White House, John Tyler's. Greatest challenge came not from enemies but from abandonment. The Whigs, the party that had nominated him, quickly turned against him. When he vetoed legislation to establish a new national bank, one of their core priorities, they recoiled. Congressional Whigs began to see Tyler not as a partner, but a traitor. His cabinet resigned, one by one, save for Secretary of State Daniel Webster. Party leaders expelled him. Newspapers mocked him with a cruel nickname. His accidency, Tyler didn't bend. He believed deeply in limited government and strict constitutional boundaries. He saw the national bank as overreach. He governed by principle, not popularity, even as his circle of support vanished. In the White House, he continued his duties, surrounded more by family than advisors. His second marriage, the first ever by a sitting president, brought personal comfort, but politically, he was more isolated than any president before or since, with no party to defend him and no machine to amplify his voice. Tyler's presidency became a lesson in solitude. He operated quietly, signing laws he agreed with, vetoing those he did not. His actions were careful, deliberate, and often unnoticed. He was not a president of grand moments. He was a president of stubborn resolve. And as the months passed, he learned how cold the nation's highest office could become when the warmth of alliance is gone. Old without backing despite his loneliness in power, John Tyler did not shrink. With no party, no political safety net, and few allies, he made decisions that would shape America's future. One of the most significant was the annexation of Texas. At the time, Texas was an independent republic, having won its freedom from Mexico. Tyler believed that Texas belonged in the Union and that its vast lands would strengthen the United States, but annexation was controversial. It touched every nerve: expansion, slavery, war, and balance of power. Many feared that adding Texas would provoke conflict with Mexico. Others worried it would tip the scale in favor of slave-holding states. Still, Tyler pushed forward. He negotiated a treaty. The Senate rejected it. So he found another route: a joint resolution, requiring only a simple majority. At the end of his term, Congress passed it. Texas would become part of the United States. Tyler also worked on tariffs, seeking a balance between government revenue and support for domestic industry. He vetoed extreme versions and settled for compromise, trying to ease economic tension. Without breaking his constitutional views, he even signed the first treaty with China, opening trade routes and laying foundations for future diplomacy. All without a party. All with the knowledge that history might overlook him. His presidency was one of quiet courage, not backed by applause, but by a steady belief that doing what was right mattered more than doing what was popular, and though few cheered him then. His decisions echoed long beyond his time. A foreshadow of division, John Tyler was a Southerner, a Virginian, a man shaped by traditions of state sovereignty, local power, and cautious federalism. as the national conversation turned toward slavery. His positions became clearer and more divisive. He opposed efforts to restrict slavery's expansion. He believed the federal government had no right to interfere in the practice where it already existed. He favored the rights of states to decide their own futures. These views placed him firmly on one side of an increasingly fractured country. Though he spoke in the language of law and constitutionality, the consequences were deeply human even after his presidency. Tyler continued to support Southern interests. When secession loomed, he sided with Virginia. He helped organize the Peace Conference of 1861, a last attempt to avoid war. When it failed, he accepted secession and joined the Confederate Congress. It was a final act of loyalty to his region, but a betrayal to many Americans. He became the only U.S. president to openly support the Confederacy. In Tyler's journey, the early warning signs of civil war are visible. He embodied the complexity of the moment, a leader who loved the Union, but feared federal power, who honored law, but excused its cruelties. He wasn't a firebrand. He didn't yell, but his choices drew quiet lines between people. And in those lines, the fabric of unity began to fray. His life, and especially his post-presidency, became a bridge between America's founding ideals and its greatest fracture, exiled by history. John Tyler died in 1862 during the second year of the Civil War. By then, he had been elected to the Confederate House of Representatives. When he passed away, the Union led by President Abraham Lincoln chose not to acknowledge his death. There was no flag lowered to half-mast, no official statement, no ceremony. Tyler had once been President of the United States. But in the eyes of many, he had abandoned that role when he chose the Confederacy. He died not as a unifying figure, but as a symbol of division. For decades, his memory remained dim. He left no grand legacy, no towering speech. His name faded from public schools and street signs. Even today, he remains one of the least remembered American presidents, but in the quiet corners of history, Tyler's mark is undeniable. He resolved a constitutional mystery by taking power firmly after Harrison's death. He showed that a president without support could still lead. He opened new states, signed new treaties, and stood by his beliefs even when it cost him everything. His story is not one of triumph, but of tension. Not of victory, but of precedent. In Tyler's stillness, in his isolation, in his refusal to follow the crowd, we find a lesson that leadership is not always about being loved. Sometimes it's about being steady when everyone else steps away, and though he may be forgotten by many, the office he shaped, the decisions he made, and the silence that greeted his passing all remain. The quiet conqueror, James K. Polk. James K. Polk was not expected to be president. When the Democratic Convention of 1844 began, his name was barely mentioned. He had served in Congress, been Speaker of the House, and governed Tennessee. But he was not a national star. He was a loyal party man, a quiet figure, a name known mostly in Southern and Western circles. But as party leaders argued and ballots multiplied, Polk emerged as a compromise. A dark horse candidate acceptable to many, exciting to few. Yet that very neutrality became his strength. He was consistent, focused, trusted. When Polk accepted the nomination, he did so with a clear plan. He would serve only one term, just 4 years. But in those 4 years, he would pursue an agenda more ambitious than many had dared. His list was short, but bold: lower tariffs, an independent treasury, settlement of the Oregon boundary, and acquisition of California. He saw the presidency not as a stage for speech, but as a tool for action. Polk didn't charm crowds. He didn't chase applause. He worked. Long hours, few breaks. He read every bill, tracked every vote, and met frequently with advisers. His style was tireless, intense, and exact. He may not have wanted the spotlight, but once in it, he stood with purpose. Not a performer, but a planner. Not a symbol, but a worker dot in the shadows of more dramatic figures. Polk quietly prepared to reshape the map of a continent. Fulfilling the mission, Polk entered office with a checklist, and he approached it with the discipline of an accountant, the intensity of a general, and the clarity of a man who knew he had only one term. First came tariffs. He lowered them, aiming to stimulate trade and reduce burdens on the South. Then the Treasury. He restored the independent Treasury system, ensuring that federal funds would be managed without private banks. He settled a long-simmering dispute with Britain over the Oregon Territory. Tensions had flared over where the boundary should fall. 50-40 or fight. Some cried, but Polk preferred peace. Through careful negotiation, he secured Oregon's southern half, present-day Oregon, Washington and Idaho. Without war, he wasn't a man of fiery speeches. He didn't posture or provoke. He executed. Behind closed doors, in firm meetings, through strategic appointments, he made government move. Few presidents before or after matched his level of fulfilled promises. He said what he would do, and he did it. Polk believed the presidency had a mission. He didn't see it as a personal reward. He rarely smiled in portraits. He avoided celebrations. He wanted results, not reverence, and though his term was filled with challenge, few could argue with its effectiveness. In one sweep of determination, he left an administration that moved with surprising speed and permanent consequences. Polk governed not for memory, but for momentum. And history would be carried by the results. War with Mexico, the most defining and divisive chapter of Polk's presidency, was the war with Mexico. It began over boundaries. Texas had been annexed by the U.S., but Mexico still claimed part of the land. Polk, seeing opportunity, sent troops to the disputed zone. When shots were fired, he declared that blood had been spilled on American soil. Congress approved war. It was a swift and sweeping campaign. U.S. forces marched into California, New Mexico, and deep into Mexico itself. General Winfield Scott even captured Mexico City. The American flag flew over lands few had imagined would one day be states. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war in 1848. The United States gained half of Mexico's territory, including present-day California. Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. It was one of the largest land acquisitions in U.S. history. But it came with a heavy cost. Critics called it a war of aggression, a land grab, a conquest disguised as defense. Among them was a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln, who questioned Polk's motives and challenged his justification. The war reignited debates about slavery. Would the new lands allow it? Would. They unbalanced the delicate line between free and slave states. Polk had expanded the nation, but also deepened its divides. He did not dwell on the morality. He saw destiny, geography, and opportunity. He believed in a coast-to-coast nation. And with the treaty signed, he had achieved it, but history would remember the price. The bloodshed, the bitterness, the questions left behind. In Polk's vision, the map was complete. In America's heart, the wound had only begun to open. Westward, vision long before highways, trains, or even telegraphs, Polk saw nations stretching from sea to sea. It wasn't just about land. It was about destiny. Manifest destiny, the belief that America was meant to fill the continent, to carry its values westward, To connect Atlantic to Pacific, Polk made that dream real. The acquisition of Oregon and the Southwest meant that America's borders now touched two oceans. The dream had become a shape-wide, wild, and finished dot in California. Gold would soon be discovered. In the new territories, settlers would pour in. Railroads, towns, and industries would rise. But in Polk's time, it was still raw land full of promise and peril. He pushed for infrastructure, for ports, for surveying, for treaties that would allow movement and trade. He wasn't a builder of roads, but a planner of direction. The America he left behind looked nothing like the one he inherited. In 4 short years, he had added over 1.2 million square miles. No president, before or after, would expand the nation more, yet he never bragged, never basked. He returned to Tennessee after his term, weary and worn. He had refused a second term. True to his word, he had completed his mission, and his energy had been spent just 3 months after leaving office. James K. Polk died. He was 53. His presidency was brief, intense, and transformative. He didn't campaign for power. He didn't cling to it. He came to fulfill a vision and left the stage as soon as it was done. No drama. No farewell tour. Just silence, a quiet conqueror. A legacy that lived not in speeches but in maps. The general on shaky ground, Zachary Taylor, never dreamed of the presidency. He spent most of his life far from politics in military camps across rugged terrain, leading soldiers into conflict. For 40 years he served the nation with little interest in government beyond duty. He didn't vote. He rarely spoke on policy. He focused on war, not words, and yet, after leading American forces to victories in the Mexican-American War, the nation turned its eyes to him. Taylor was hailed as a hero. Newspapers praised his bravery. Crowds cheered his return. To many he embodied strength, simplicity, and honesty, the traits of a leader. The Whig Party saw opportunity. They needed a candidate who could win hearts. And Taylor's battlefield fame offered that hope. Though he had no formal political background, his reputation carried weight. He accepted the nomination with quiet surprise. There were no grand speeches, no campaign trails, just a man drawn into politics by the gravity of fame and the hunger of a divided country. In 1848, he won the presidency. He took office as a mystery, a soldier in a suit, a stranger in the Capitol. No one knew what to expect. Was he a figurehead, a firm hand, a neutral bridge? Taylor arrived with few promises, no agenda, and little experience. But beneath the uniform was a man of conviction, one who would soon be tested by the country's deepest tensions. A soldier in the White House, Taylor's leadership style did not change with his new title. He remained a soldier at heart, calm under pressure, direct in thought, unshaken by noise. He disliked partisanship. He distrusted politicians. He preferred action to ceremony. His cabinet meetings were efficient, his conversations brief. He was not one for elaborate plans, but he listened carefully, weighed options quietly, and then chose with certainty. He brought a military sense of order to the White House. Simplicity guided him. Clarity grounded him. Taylor believed in unity, not through speeches, but through fairness. He saw the Union as worth protecting above all. He didn't use lofty rhetoric. Instead, he relied on his reputation for personal honor. What mattered most to him was loyalty not to a party, but to principle. He resisted pressure from party leaders. He followed his own compass, shaped by years in uniform and a lifetime of discipline. His straightforwardness made him unpredictable in Washington. He wasn't easily swayed. He didn't play political games. Allies found him hard to read. Opponents found him hard to move, but he was respected. Even those who disagreed with him saw a man who meant what he said, who stood for something steady. In the Oval Office, Taylor brought the steadiness of a battlefield tent, quiet, focused, and firm in the face of approaching storms, slavery on the horizon as new lands were added to the nation following the Mexican-American War. The question loomed, would slavery expand into these territories? Taylor, a Southerner and a slaveholder himself, took a stance that surprised many. He opposed the extension of slavery into the new territories. He believed that the people living there should decide their own futures and that the Union should not be torn apart over an institution he viewed as dangerous to national harmony. He supported California and New Mexico's admission as free states. He urged Congress to avoid delays and grant them statehood. But this stance infuriated many Southern leaders who had expected Taylor to defend their interests. They had helped elect him. Now they felt betrayed. Tensions rose. Talk of secession began to spread. Southern politicians hinted that they would break away from the Union if slavery were threatened, but Taylor stood firm. He warned against rebellion. He vowed to use force if necessary to preserve the nation. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words carried the weight of his resolve. He made it clear that no state had the right to secede, and that any attempt would be met with strength, not compromise. His position placed him in the eye of a gathering storm. He wasn't a political philosopher. He didn't use elegant arguments. But he saw the danger, and he faced it. In that moment, Taylor became more than a general. He became a guardian of a fragile peace, holding back a nation on the edge of fracture. A sudden death on July 4, 1850. President Zachary Taylor attended a celebration at the Washington Monument grounds. The day was hot. The air was thick. He returned to the White House exhausted, thirsty, and overheated. He drank cold milk, ate cherries, and by nightfall he fell ill. Over the next 5 days, his condition worsened. Doctors were called. Treatments were given, but none helped. His fever climbed. His stomach churned. Pain deepened. On July 9, 1850, Zachary Taylor died. He had been president for just 16 months. Rumors swirled for decades. Some believed he had been poisoned, a victim of political betrayal. Others saw it as a tragic accident, a moment of misfortune at a time when medicine knew little about infection, bacteria, or hydration. Modern science leans toward natural causes, likely acute gastroenteritis, worsened by heat and improper treatment, but the effect was the same. A nation was stunned. His death brought new uncertainty. Millard Fillmore, the vice president, took over. The direction of the presidency shifted. Compromises were made that Taylor might never have allowed, and the questions he had faced about slavery, about unity, about rebellion remained unresolved. Taylor did not have the time to shape the storm, but he had felt its winds, and he had tried, in his own steady way, to stand against them. He left no doctrine, no sweeping vision. But in his brief time, he showed that conviction could live in quiet men, and that leadership could come not from ambition but from duty. His was a presidency cut short, but not without meaning. He came from the battlefield, and in the nation's capital, he gave his final stand. The caretaker, President Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore was a quiet man in a loud time. When President Zachary Taylor died unexpectedly in July of 1850, Fillmore, then vice president, stepped into the role without celebration or command. There was no campaign behind him, no popular groundswell of support. He simply inherited the office quietly, legally, and unceremoniously. Born in a log cabin in upstate New York, Fillmore's life had been shaped by hard work. He had worked as a cloth maker's apprentice, studied law in borrowed books, and climbed his way through local politics by patience and practicality. He wasn't a bold visionary or a war hero. He was steady, cautious, and careful, qualities that now carried him to the presidency. In the wake of Taylor's death, the nation stood on edge. Slavery debates had escalated. The country was expanding, but unity was shrinking. Congress was gridlocked, tempers flared, and whispers of secession drifted through the South. Into that storm, Fillmore walked with a deliberate calm. He did not arrive with charisma. He arrived with clarity. His first task was not to lead with brilliance, but to hold things in place. He reshuffled the cabinet, choosing experienced men who could help defuse the crisis. He worked behind the scenes, letting others speak loudly while he negotiated slowly. Fillmore did not seek greatness. He sought stability. And in a moment of danger, he gave the nation something rare, a pause. The compromise of 1850, the greatest test of Fillmore's presidency, came quickly, and it came with 5 parts. The Compromise of 1850, crafted by Senator Henry Clay and guided by voices like Daniel Webster and Stephen Douglas, aimed to cool the rising fire of sectional division. California would be admitted as a free state. The slave trade would end in Washington, D.C. But in return, the South would gain stronger protections for slaveholders, including a harsh new fugitive slave law. Fillmore supported the compromise. He believed it was the only way to prevent the Union from fracturing. He didn't see it as ideal. He saw it as necessary. With Congress divided, tempers rising, and threats echoing across state lines, he placed his signature on all 5 bills. In doing so, he delivered a fragile peace. For a moment, the shouting quieted. The threats faded, and the idea of secession slipped further from view. But beneath that calm, new wounds were forming. While California entered free, the South gained power to pursue escaped slaves across state lines. While D.C. shed the slave trade, enslaved people still lived in its shadows. It was a compromise, not a cure. Fillmore had done what many leaders dream of. He bought time. But time, as it turned out, was not enough. The issues were unsolved. They were postponed. He believed he had saved the Union. But history would later show he had only delayed the storm, the Fugitive Slave Act, among the 5 parts of the compromise. Of 1850, one bill would cast the longest shadow. The Fugitive Slave Act. This law required that runaway slaves, even if they had escaped to free states, be returned to their owners. It denied accused individuals the right to a jury trial and compelled citizens and officials in the North to assist in their capture. Fillmore signed it reluctantly, but decisively. He saw it as a condition of unity, a part of the balance. Without it, the compromise would have failed. And in that failure, he feared the Union would unravel, but the backlash was swift. In the North, abolitionists raged. Many ordinary citizens, uncomfortable with slavery but removed from it, were now asked to enforce it. Courtrooms filled with angry crowds. Secret escape routes, like the Underground Railroad, accelerated. In the South, the law was seen as justice, long overdue. But in the North, it was viewed as betrayal. The very idea of being forced to return a fellow human to bondage stirred outrage, shame, and resistance. Fillmore, a man of moderation, had hoped to calm the nation. But in trying to please both sides, he alienated many. His name, once associated with quiet leadership, began to carry the weight of moral failure. He had chosen the law. He had chosen the Union. But he had done so by silencing the cries of those who had no voice. The Fugitive Slave Act became a symbol not of compromise, but of complicity. And though Fillmore faded from politics, the memory of that signature stayed. He had wanted peace. But peace, when bought at the price of justice, seldom lasts. The Whig Party, once a force of national strength, was unraveling. It had risen in opposition to Andrew Jackson, calling for balance, order, and internal improvement. It had elected for presidents. But by the 1850s, the Whigs were splitting along sectional lines. Northern Whigs condemned slavery. Southern Whigs defended it. And in the middle stood Millard Fillmore. When he ran for president again in 1856, it was not as a Whig. The party was gone fractured beyond repair. Instead, Fillmore ran with the American Party, often called the Know-Nothings, a group focused on anti-immigrant sentiment and nativist ideas. It was a strange fit. Fillmore was not known for extremism, but he believed the Whigs were dead. And the country needed something to stand between chaos and collapse. He lost the race. After that, he stepped away. The Whigs never returned. In their place rose new parties, Republicans in the North, Democrats in the South. The center that had once held was gone. Fillmore became the last Whig president, and with his quiet exit, an era ended. The moderate middle vanished. The room for slow, careful compromise closed. Ahead, the nation faced sharper choices. His presidency had been about holding the seams together. But by the end of his public life, the seams had begun to split. He left not with fanfare, but with fatigue. In the silence that followed, America took a breath and then braced for war. A name among names today, Millard Fillmore is often remembered with a shrug. His name is mentioned with mild amusement. A trivia answer. A footnote. A man who came and went, but his story is richer than his reputation. He stepped into chaos and offered calm. He signed laws he hoped would buy peace. He worked from instinct, not ideology. He governed not for glory, but for survival. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was something harder to define, a man trying to hold a nation together while it quietly fell apart. History often celebrates the bold, the visionaries, the rebels, the firebrands. Fillmore was none of these. He was a caretaker, a quiet placeholder. Between louder presidencies, but caretakers matter. They keep the lights on. They steady the frame. They hold space while time moves forward. Fillmore's compromises didn't save the Union, but they gave it breath. His choices had cost moral, political, human, but they also reflected the weight of impossible decisions. He left office and returned to Buffalo, New York. He lived a long life after the presidency, watching from afar as the country moved toward conflict. He gave lectures, supported libraries, helped found a university. He lived simply, the way he had entered the world. When he died in 1874, the country he had tried to hold together had already been torn apart and race-stitched by war. He didn't change the course of history, but he stood still while history turned, and sometimes that quiet resistance to collapse is worth remembering. The soft voice of collapse. Franklin Pierce began his presidency in the shadow of loss. Just weeks before his inauguration, Pierce and his wife, Jane, were traveling by train with their only surviving child, an 11-year-old boy named Benjamin. In a cruel twist of fate, the train derailed. Their son was thrown from the carriage and killed before their eyes. Pierce never recovered. He took the oath of office, carrying a grief few presidents had ever known. Jane retreated into silence and mourning, refusing to participate in public life. The White House became a quiet, somber space, more like a chapel than a center of power. Pierce was a capable man, well-educated, charming, and admired for his eloquence. But now, a deep sadness hung around him. His speeches were soft, his gaze distant. his mind often elsewhere. He hoped to serve as a president of healing. But his heart was broken before he began. This tragedy colored every decision that followed. It made him more cautious, more pliable, and perhaps more desperate to find peace in a country steadily unraveling. While others roared and debated, Pierce whispered. And though his intentions were gentle, the times called for strength. He could not summon through sorrow. The nation stood on the edge of violence, and its leader walked quietly through a storm, head bowed not in dignity, but in mourning. Kansas. In flames, the central crisis of Pierce's presidency would unfold on the plains of Kansas, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Signed into law under Pierce's watch, was meant to give settlers the right to decide for themselves whether slavery would be allowed in their territories. It overturned the Missouri Compromise, which had previously banned slavery in certain areas. It was supposed to be a gesture of democracy, a way to let the people choose, but instead it invited chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas, hoping to tip the vote. What followed was not peaceful debate, but open violence. Towns were burned. People were beaten. Some were killed. It became known as Bleeding Kansas. Pierce, committed to upholding law and order, refused to take sides. He condemned the violence, but did little to stop it. He sent federal troops, but only to restore calm, not to resolve the deeper moral conflict. In trying to remain neutral, he appeared indifferent. In trying to hold the Union together, he let it fracture further. His belief in compromise blinded him to the reality. Slavery was not a political difference, it was a human crisis. Kansas burned while Washington whispered, and the president, gentle and grieving, hoped time would cool the flames. But time did not heal. It only deepened the wound. The prairie became a battleground, and the nation took another step toward war. Pierce hoped to be a president of unity. But to achieve it, he made choices that favored one side, the South. He appointed Southern allies. 2 key positions. He enforced the Fugitive Slave Act more aggressively than any president before him. He defended the Kansas-Nebraska Act, even as it tore the country apart. To many in the North, Pierce seemed like a puppet of slaveholders. His soft voice was heard as silence in the face of injustice. Pierce believed that by satisfying the South, he could prevent secession. He believed that enforcing existing laws, even cruel ones, was necessary to preserve the Union, but compromise without conscience is not peace. It is surrender. His administration also supported attempts to acquire Cuba, where slavery still flourished, through the Ostend Manifesto, a document that suggested the U.S. might seize the island by force. The proposal sparked outrage and was quickly buried, but it revealed where Pierce's sympathies leaned. He wanted calm. He wanted quiet. He wanted to please everyone, but the cost was clarity. And in choosing soft words over strong stands, Pierce lost the trust of the North. Without gaining lasting loyalty from the South, he was a man of moderation in a time that demanded moral courage. And the more he tried to hold things together, the more they slipped through his fingers. The president who wept behind the title and behind the policies, Pierce remained a man in mourning. He grieved not only for his son, but for his country. A land he loved that seemed to be unraveling. He was often seen walking the White House grounds alone. His speeches, while carefully written, were often delivered in a voice that wavered with emotion. Friends noted that he seemed tired not just physically, but spiritually. His wife, Jane, spent most of his presidency in seclusion. She wrote letters to their dead son. She wore black. The home of the president felt more like a house of mourning than a place of leadership. Pierce drank more. He leaned on close friends. But he never truly healed. He didn't seek re-election. His party denied him the nomination. By the end of his term, even his allies had drifted away. He left office quietly, riding away from Washington with the same silence that had marked his presidency, but he carried guilt. He believed he had failed, and perhaps he had not through malice, but through melancholy. History does not remember him with fire or fury. It remembers him with a whisper. He was a man who tried to soothe a nation that no longer wanted soothing, who tried to stay neutral in a world that was breaking in half, and in the quiet moments of his life, long after power had left him, he looked back not with pride but with sorrow. A gentle fade Franklin Pierce lived for over a decade after leaving office. But he never returned to politics. He never gave another speech of consequence. He never sought redemption. He watched as the country he once led fell into civil war. He wrote letters, offered opinions, but mostly he faded. He opposed Abraham Lincoln's war policies, believing they were too harsh. He criticized the suspension of civil liberties, but his voice no longer carried. The world had moved on. Jane died in 1863. Pierce, alone and adrift, moved between his New Hampshire home and brief visits with friends. He read books. He took walks. He drank. When he died in 1869, few came to mourn. No great monuments were built. No songs were sung. He had entered the presidency with hope. He had left it with heartbreak, but in the soft spaces between events, Pierce's story still matters. He reminds us that leadership is not just about policy, it is about presence. That a nation on the edge needs more than good intentions. It needs strength, clarity, and sometimes confrontation. Pierce was not a villain. He was not cruel, but he was overwhelmed. His was a gentle fade, the slow retreat of a man who wanted to help, but could not hold back the tide, and in that fading, the final lights of compromise dimmed, making way for war. The last before the storm, James Buchanan entered the presidency with a calm demeanor and a belief in legal order. A seasoned diplomat and lifelong politician, he had served abroad, in Congress, and as Secretary of State. He believed in process. He trusted systems. He held tightly to the Constitution, like a lifeline in troubled seas, but the sea was not calm. By the time Buchanan took office in 1857, the nation was already strained. Slavery was no longer just a regional issue, it had become a moral chasm. Politicians argued. Newspapers screamed. Communities armed themselves. Buchanan, a bachelor president without close family or personal scandal, hoped to be above the noise. He believed that if he simply obeyed the law and stayed neutral, the storm would pass, but silence, in times of fire, is rarely read as wisdom. His refusal to take a firm stand on slavery left the country drifting. Where leadership was needed, he offered delay. Where clarity was needed, he offered caution. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't corrupt. But he was distant, removed. Presiding with decorum while the nation fractured under his watch, Buchanan thought his restraint would preserve the Union. But history would see it differently as absence in the face of urgency, bleeding Kansas. And Dred Scott, two events would define Buchanan's early presidency, both dark, both decisive. In Kansas, civil war had already broken out. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed violently. Towns were attacked, families displaced. The territory burned while Washington debated, rather than intervened decisively. Buchanan supported a pro-slavery territorial government in Kansas, even though its legitimacy was widely questioned. He hoped recognizing it would restore order. Instead, it deepened the chaos. At the same time, the Supreme Court issued one of its most infamous decisions, the Dred Scott ruling. It declared that Black Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. The decision stunned the North. It confirmed what many had feared, that the government was now a tool of slaveholding. Interests Buchanan quietly supported the ruling. In fact, he had even spoken with members of the court before the decision was released, urging them to settle the issue decisively. But far from settling anything, the decision poured fuel on the fire. The president's belief in legality blinded him to the humanity at stake. While courts and laws played out on paper, people bled in the streets. He saw his role as a guardian of institutions. But the institutions were cracking, and in defending process over people, Buchanan lost the trust of a country already unraveling. By the end of Buchanan's presidency, the United States was no longer merely divided, it was breaking. Southern states were talking openly of secession. Northern voices demanded firmer resistance to slavery. Congress was paralyzed. The political center had collapsed. Buchanan, nearing the end of his term, insisted that secession was illegal, but also claimed the federal government had no right to stop it. It was a paradox, a contradiction. He acknowledged the threat, but offered no defense. He watched as state after state left the Union and did nothing to halt the fall. He believed that compromise might still be possible. That reason would return. That tempers would cool, but time had run out even within his own. Cabinet divisions sharpened. Southern members resigned as their states seceded. Loyalty fractured. Authority eroded. He gave speeches calling for unity, but they rang hollow. The people wanted direction. They got delay. In the absence of action, fear grew. Militias formed. Supplies were seized. Forts were taken. It was no longer a question of if war would come, but when. Buchanan had once hoped to be the peacemaker. But peace requires movement. And movement had never been his strength. His administration ended not in stability, but in collapse. A house divided, crumbling under its own silence. Legacy of inaction. James Buchanan left office with the nation in pieces. He hoped to be remembered as a stabilizer, a man who upheld the Constitution in difficult times, but history judged him more harshly. He was seen not as a healer, but as a bystander. Not as a unifier, but as a man who let unity slip away. In later years, Buchanan defended himself. He wrote memoirs. He blamed Congress, abolitionists, and extremists. He insisted he had done what the law allowed, but the law had not been enough. The presidency is not only about rules, it is about leadership. It is about guiding through fire, not standing in the doorway. Buchanan had the experience. He had the intellect, but he lacked the urgency. He treated the nation's breakdown as a disagreement to be moderated, not a crisis to be confronted, and as a result, his name became a warning, the last before the war. The man who saw the storm gather and failed to act. He didn't break the Union, but he did nothing to hold it together. In the quiet that followed his presidency, his silence echoed louder than any speech. The storm arrives on March 4, 1861. James. Buchanan handed the presidency to Abraham Lincoln. By then, 7 states had seceded. Fort Sumter was under threat. The Confederacy had formed. War was weeks away. Buchanan greeted Lincoln politely. He smiled. He said little. The carriage ride to the Capitol was awkward, quiet. Lincoln now faced the fire Buchanan had tried to avoid. As the new president delivered his inaugural address, Buchanan sat nearby watching, listening, fading. In retirement, he returned to Pennsylvania. He kept a low profile, writing defenses of his time in office, hosting visitors, and watching from afar as the war unfolded. He never returned to power. He never sought public office again. He died in 1868, 1 year before the 15th Amendment was ratified, granting Black Americans the right to vote. A country remade by war, reshaped by sacrifice, stood far from the one he had tried and failed to preserve. James Buchanan's story is one of absence, of how not doing enough can sometimes be worse than doing the wrong thing. His was a quiet failure, a soft collapse, and though he left office before the first shot was fired, his shadow lingered long after Dot in the silence before the storm. Buchanan stood still, and in that stillness, the fire was born. The unbreakable Union, Abraham Lincoln, was born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky in 1809. There was no silver spoon, no family privilege, no comfort. He grew up in the dirt and wood of frontier America, chopping trees, reading by candlelight, learning from borrowed books. His early life was marked by loss. His mother died when he was 9. He had little formal education, but he absorbed knowledge like air. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He thought deeply, listened closely, and spoke with quiet purpose. What he lacked in polish, he made up for in persistence. He walked miles to borrow a book. He memorized stories, laws, and speeches. And from this raw, rural life, a mind took. Shape-sharp, steady, and deeply human, Lincoln became a lawyer. Then a congressman. Then a name on the edge of national debates. He hated slavery not just for what it did, but for what it meant. He believed every person had dignity, that no one was born to rule another, but he also believed in the law, in process, in patience. He was not a radical, but a reformer. And that made him hard to label, hard to attack, and impossible to ignore. His rise was not fast, but it was sure. People trusted his plainness, his honesty, his sense of right and wrong, and when the country teetered on the edge of collapse, Lincoln was chosen not because he promised glory, but because he promised steadiness, a nation torn by the time. Lincoln took office in 1861. 7 states had already seceded. The Union was fracturing. The Civil War was no longer a threat, it was reality. Lincoln had never wanted war. But he knew the Union must stand. To let it split was to accept that democracy could break when pressure came. And so he held the line. The war that followed was brutal. Brother against brother. Towns burned. Fields soaked in blood. More Americans would die in this conflict than in any other. Lincoln visited battlefields. He shook hands with soldiers. He read casualty lists until his eyes blurred. He met with generals, walked hospital corridors, and wrote letters to grieving mothers. But above all, he remained in the White House while threats circled. He faced critics, conspirators, and endless sorrow. Yet he did not flinch. Lincoln saw the war not just as a military fight, but as a test of the nation's soul. Could a free people stay united through fire? Could the idea of America survive its own contradictions? In his speeches, he didn't shout. He reasoned. He reflected. He mourned. He knew war would scar the land, but he hoped it could also cleanse it of the sin of slavery, of the poison of hatred, of the division born from fear. Through it all, Lincoln became more than a leader. He became a symbol of fragile strength, of quiet courage, of unshakable purpose, emancipation, and resolve. At first, Lincoln's goal was to save the Union. But over time, the war's deeper purpose revealed itself. He knew slavery was the root, not just of division, but of moral decay. It had to end. Not someday. Now. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that enslaved people in rebellious states were free. It didn't end slavery everywhere, but it changed the war's meaning. From that moment, the fight was not just about states. It was about souls. Freedom became the banner. And with it, Black Americans found new courage. Thousands joined the Union Army. Their bravery, their service helped turn the tide. Lincoln was not always certain. He worried. He debated. But he kept moving forward. He knew that half measures would not heal. He pushed for the 13th Amendment to end slavery once and for all. And though he did not live to see its final passage, his force behind it made it real. Emancipation was more than law. It was a statement that this nation would no longer deny humanity. Lincoln didn't free the enslaved with a stroke of a pen. He freed them with endurance, with belief, with action backed by heart. He had been slow to start. But once he did, he never turned back. In doing so, he helped redeem the promise of America, not just in words, but in truth, words that healed Lincoln's. Strength lay not just in his policy, but in his poetry. In November 1863, he stood on a battlefield in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, where tens of thousands had died. The speech he gave lasted just 2 minutes. But in those few lines, he reshaped the nation's purpose, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Simple, powerful, eternal. Later, in his second inaugural address, with the war nearly over, he did not boast. He did not blame. He offered grace, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in. He wanted healing, not vengeance. A future, not a grudge. His words weren't written for applause. They were written for reflection, for peace. Lincoln understood that people needed hope as much as leadership. That wounds, even righteous ones, need tending. His speeches were short, his metaphors biblical, his tone solemn. He did not promise ease, but he offered meaning, and through that meaning, millions found comfort. Soldiers carried his words. Families quoted them in letters. Teachers recited them in schoolrooms. In a country split by war, Lincoln stitched with syllables. He spoke not just as a president, but as a poet of democracy, one whose verse softened the edges of conflict and pointed to something better. In a time of guns, his greatest weapons were words. The man who followed Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, the night Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, a silent weight fell across the country. In that moment, America lost not just a leader, but a symbol of unity at the edge of healing. Into this quiet storm stepped Andrew Johnson, a man shaped not by the vision of tomorrow, but by the burdens of the past. Johnson, a tailor's son from North Carolina, was never meant to carry the presidency. His rise came not through broad support, but through tragedy. As vice president for just over a month, he suddenly found himself sworn in, eyes wide with shock, voice trembling with uncertainty. Johnson was a Southerner who had stayed loyal to the Union. That loyalty made him seem, to some, like a possible bridge between the bitter halves of the country. But bridges must be steady, and Johnson's footing was uncertain. He lacked Lincoln's gift for moral clarity and his patience for opposing views. Where Lincoln balanced justice and mercy, Johnson often chose pride. In those early weeks, hope lingered that Johnson would rise to the occasion, that he might carry forward Lincoln's unfinished dream of a truly reunited nation. But healing a wounded country required more than keeping the Union together on paper. It required wisdom, empathy, and foresight. Johnson, in his stubbornness, struggled to offer any. He believed Reconstruction should be swift and forgiving, not to the formerly enslaved, but to the former Confederates. He issued sweeping pardons, restored lands, and welcomed back leaders who had waged war on the very flag now behind his desk. It was a gesture meant to quiet the South, but it came at a cost. The voices of newly freed men and women were left unheard, their needs brushed aside. In stepping into Lincoln's shoes, Johnson never tried to fill them. Instead, He seemed determined to walk a path entirely his own, a path marked by conflict, missteps, and mischances. From the very beginning, his presidency bore the shadow of a man whose legacy he could not match, and a moment in history too heavy for him to lift, a Southerner in the North. Andrew Johnson's presidency quickly became a war of wills, not with generals, but with lawmakers. As a Southern Democrat presiding over a Republican-led Congress, tension simmered from the start. Reconstruction, the great national project meant to rebuild the country, became a battlefield of ideas. At its center stood a man who refused to bend. Johnson believed that the Southern states had never truly left the Union, that their rebellion was a break in loyalty, not legality. As such, he saw no need to remake their governments or impose new protections for the formerly enslaved. He insisted that states should decide their own fates, even as they wrote laws that pushed black citizens back into bondage through loopholes and force. Congress saw something else. The radical Republicans, in particular, viewed Reconstruction as a chance to redefine the very soul of the nation to ensure civil rights, voting power, and dignity for those who had long been denied it. They passed acts to protect freedmen, to place the South under military oversight, to build something lasting from the ashes of war. Johnson met them not with partnership, but with vetoes. Again and again, he rejected laws that aimed to uplift the South's black population. To him, these measures were overreach. To Congress, his opposition was obstruction. The distance between them widened into open hostility. His speeches became sharp, his tone combative. At times, Johnson seemed to relish the conflict, casting himself as a lone defender of the Constitution against an overbearing Congress. But this posture only deepened divides. Instead of healing the Union, he inflamed its wounds. Instead of rising above partisanship, he plunged into it. The nation watched, confused and exhausted. Freedmen feared for their futures. Northerners questioned Johnson's loyalty. Southerners, emboldened by his leniency, began restoring old systems under new names. The fragile hope that had flickered in the wake of Lincoln's death began to dim. Johnson had the power to shape a new America, but he used that power to protect the old. His vision narrow, rooted in states' rights, and personal pride clashed with a country struggling to redefine itself. And in doing so, he set the stage for a political reckoning unlike any the presidency had seen before. Vetoes and impeachment, the conflict between Johnson and Congress, could not hold forever. Brick by brick, the walls of cooperation crumbled, until all that remained was confrontation. Johnson vetoed nearly every major piece of Reconstruction legislation. Congress responded by overriding him, a rare and humbling rebuke that happened again and again. Among the most pivotal laws was the Tenure of Office Act, passed to prevent Johnson from removing key officials who supported congressional reconstruction. In particular, it sought to protect Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who had become a symbol of resistance against Johnson's leniency. But Johnson, firm in his convictions and tired of opposition, fired Stanton anyway. It was a move that Congress had warned against, and one that would ignite a constitutional crisis. In 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Andrew Johnson. For the first time in American history, a sitting president stood trial before the Senate. The charge, violating the Tenure of Office Act and abusing his power. The trial was tense, dramatic, and filled with uncertainty. The nation, still reeling from war and struggling with Reconstruction, now faced a different kind of test, one not of guns and armies, but of laws and leadership. In the end, Johnson survived, but only just. The Senate fell one vote short of the two-thirds majority needed to remove him from office. It was a narrow escape and not a vindication. Johnson had become the first president impeached, a title no one sought, though he remained in the white. House, his power was broken. Congress took firm control of Reconstruction, pushing forward without him. His influence faded, his voice no longer the loudest in the room. The impeachment had revealed more than a political battle. It showed a deeper struggle over the meaning of leadership, the role of law, and the future of a divided nation. Johnson, by clinging to old beliefs and resisting new realities, had isolated himself. The country moved on slowly, painfully, but forward. And Johnson, though still president in name, became more a figure of conflict than command. His term, once filled with possibility, now stood marked by confrontation and cautionary lessons. Missed opportunities. History is not kind to those who hold power, but fail to wield it wisely. In Johnson's case, his presidency became a study in what might have been a reminder that leadership requires not only authority, but vision. He inherited a moment of deep possibility, and at every turn, he chose resistance over reconciliation instead. Of building on Lincoln's legacy, he broke from it. Instead of recognizing the needs of a changing nation, he clung to the past. The freedmen whose lives had shifted from chains to choices needed laws, protection, and dignity. Johnson gave them silence. He had the chance to guide the South through a just recovery. He could have championed schools for black children, supported fair labor laws, or encouraged diverse voices in the halls of government. He did none of these. His belief in limited government became a shield not for liberty, but for inequality. What makes Johnson's story so heavy is not only what he did, but what he refused to do. He saw Reconstruction not as a path to healing, but as a battlefield to defend the old order. His policies delayed progress and deepened mistrust. The scars of that era would stretch long into the future. Even those closest to the heart of the conflict saw the missed potential. Former slaves hoped for land, for justice, for a place in the democracy they had helped preserve with their blood. They received little. White Southerners, forgiven quickly, restored systems that looked strikingly familiar. Johnson's leniency became a license for regression. In stepping into history's spotlight, Andrew Johnson could have redefined it. Instead, he recoiled from its demands. His was not the healing hand the nation needed. And while the office granted him power, the moment demanded something greater, courage. Time would move on, and other leaders would take up the challenge. But the cracks that widened under Johnson's watch would take generations to mend. And his name would remain a caution not for ambition, but for absence. The silent strength, Ulysses S. Grant. In a nation torn by conflict, heroes often arrive not with fanfare, but with quiet resolve. Ulysses S. Grant was one such man. Born in Ohio in 1822, he showed little interest in glory. He didn't dream of battlefield victories or medals. Instead, he liked horses, wide skies, and silence. Even at West Point, where cadets were trained to lead, Grant stood apart not for his ambition, but for his calm. When war first came, not the Civil War, but the Mexican-American War, Grant served without complaint, yet came home disillusioned by the violence. He left the army and tried civilian life. Farming real estate, even selling firewood on the streets, he failed often, but never loudly. He carried burdens with quiet endurance. Then, in 1861, the Civil War began. The country fractured, and Grant, reluctant but loyal, returned to the army. His rise was steady, not sudden. While others postured and hesitated, Grant moved with simple focus. He won battles not through flair, but through determination. Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, Chattanooga. Each victory came with a heavy price, but also with clarity. This man understood war. Abraham Lincoln noticed. He saw in Grant what others missed, a steady hand in a storm. In 1864, Lincoln gave Grant control of all Union armies. Grant didn't celebrate. He tightened his belt and marched forward. The war grew bloodier. But slowly, inevitably, the Union advanced. In April 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. The war was over. Grant, in that moment of triumph, showed grace. He offered generous terms, asking only that Confederate soldiers return home in peace. There were no grand speeches, no chest pounding, just dignity. Grant never wanted war. But when his country needed him, he answered not with thunder, but with strength. He had proven himself not just a general, but a man of quiet purpose. Yet the true test of his leadership was still to come. Because peace, as he would learn, demands more patience than war, leading with calm after the war, Grant became a symbol of national unity. He was beloved in the North, respected in the South, and admired for his humility. In 1868, he was elected president. Once again, he hadn't sought the role, but the country turned to him not for brilliance, but for balance, his. Presidency began with hope. The nation was fragile, but not broken. Reconstruction was still unfolding, and Grant believed in healing, not punishment. He wanted the South restored, but not at the cost of justice. And he wanted peace, true peace, not silence enforced. By fear. In the White House, Grant brought the same calm demeanor he had shown on the battlefield. He listened more than he spoke. He valued loyalty above charm. He rarely gave grand addresses. Instead, he governed with a steady hand, trusting his cabinet and seeking harmony in a time of unrest, but the post-war years were messy. Freedmen faced backlash. Former Confederates resisted change. In some states, violence erupted as white supremacist groups tried to regain control. Through it all, Grant remained firm. The war had ended, but equality was not negotiable. He used federal power to enforce civil rights laws and sent troops when necessary to protect black citizens from terror. It wasn't always popular. Many in the North grew weary of the South's problems. But Grant stood by his principles. Still, governing was different from commanding. Politics was full of maneuvering, whispers, and shifting alliances. Grant, so straightforward in battle, struggled in this landscape. He made decisions from the heart, not from calculation. And that heart, noble and trusting, sometimes led him into trouble. Yet through conflict and uncertainty, he never raised his voice. He bore criticism quietly. He never retaliated with words. Even as newspapers mocked him and Congress resisted him, Grant continued his quiet work. He believed in the Constitution. He believed in equal rights. And most of all, he believed in the idea that America could still hold together if only its leaders stood firm. Scandals in the cabinet, no presidency, is without blemish, and for Grant, the shadows came from those he trusted. While he worked to unify a country, some of the men around him worked for themselves. Scandals crept in like smoke, quiet at first, then thick and choking. Grant's greatest flaw was not greed, but loyalty. He believed in people. He stood by friends. He forgave easily. And in politics, that made him vulnerable. Opportunists took advantage. Some of his appointees abused their power. Bribes were accepted. Money changed hands behind closed doors. The most infamous scandal was the whiskey ring, a network of government officials and distillers who cheated the Treasury out of millions in taxes. When Grant learned of it, he was outraged. He ordered full prosecution. But when one of the accused was a close friend, he hesitated. His loyalty clouded his judgment. To the public, it looked like favoritism. To Grant, it was simply belief in a friend's honesty. Other scandals followed. The Carr dit Mobilier affair, the Indian ring. Each one chipped away at the public's trust. Grant himself was never implicated, but the pattern was clear. His faith in people, once a virtue, had become a liability. Critics called his administration corrupt. Some whispered that the quiet general had become a blind leader. But Grant, though shaken, did not lash out. He stayed silent, let the investigations unfold, and focused on the work ahead. These years were heavy for him. He loved his country, and it pained him to see it question his integrity. He had led armies with honor, yet now he struggled to lead a cabinet without scandal. Still, he never gave up. He believed in redemption. He believed that leadership wasn't about image, but about endurance. History would later judge him more gently. Scholars would see that while the scandals were real, so was Grant's honesty. He never enriched himself. He never schemed. He simply trusted too much. And in politics, the trust cost him dearly, but even in these troubled times, Grant's core remained unchanged. He was still the man who had accepted surrender with grace, a leader who didn't seek greatness, but bore it with quiet strength, defending civil rights. Of all the battles Grant faced in peace, the fight for civil rights was the one he took most personally. He had seen black soldiers bleed for the Union. He had watched freedmen step into fragile freedom. And he understood that Reconstruction wasn't just about rebuilding, it was about recognizing dignity. When white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose up, Grant didn't hesitate. He signed the Enforcement Acts, giving federal authorities the power to act against racial violence. In some southern states, the Klan was crushed not by war, but by law. He pushed for the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. It passed during his presidency, opening the door for black men to enter politics, serve in Congress, and shape their communities. It was a moment of real progress, but progress has enemies. Backlash came swift and brutal. White politicians in the South began finding new ways to suppress black votes. Northern support for Reconstruction faded. People grew tired. The country wanted to move on. Still, Grant stood firm. He knew the struggle was not over. He gave speeches defending equality. He used federal troops when states failed to protect their citizens. He made civil rights part of his legacy, not for applause, but because he believed it was right. These efforts cost him politically. Some allies distanced themselves. Others accused him of overreach. But Grant never backed down. He didn't speak loudly, but his actions spoke for him. In time, the tide turned. Reconstruction ended. Federal troops withdrew. The South imposed new laws that undid much of what Grant had tried to protect. And yet, in that fading light, his efforts left an impression, a record of resistance against injustice. Years later, when civil rights leaders looked back, they saw in Grant an early ally. Not perfect, but brave. Not a savior, but a man who used power with purpose. In a time when silence was easy, Grant chose to act. His defense of civil rights was not loud. It was not flawless, but it was real. And for those who lived under the threat of violence and the hope of freedom, that mattered. Even in disappointment, they remembered him as someone who tried and who never turned away. The Memoirs of a Soldier. After 2 terms in office, Grant stepped away from politics. He traveled the world, greeted like a hero in distant lands. But at home, his finances crumbled. A failed investment, one he entered out of trust, left him penniless. Then came illness, throat cancer. The diagnosis was grim. Grant, once a man of battlefields, now faced a final war, this one inside his own body. His voice weakened. Pain grew. Time was short, but instead of retreating, he picked up a pen. With encouragement from his friend Mark Twain, Grant began writing his memoirs. He worked every day, even when speaking hurt. His goal was simple: to leave his family financially secure. And to tell his story with honesty, he wrote about war, the movements, the decisions, the losses. But he also wrote about duty, about friendship, about what it means to serve something greater than oneself. There was no self-pity in his words. Only clarity. As his health declined, the writing became his mission. He finished just days before his death. And when the book was published, it became an instant success. Readers saw not just a general or a president, but a man quiet, thoughtful, and deeply human, the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant remains one of the finest military autobiographies ever written. But more than that, it stands as a final act of courage. A soldier's last. Offering to a nation he had given everything to, Grant died in 1885, surrounded by family. There were no fireworks, no victory parades. Only peace. The kind he had always sought, not through power, but through perseverance. His story is one of strength without noise, of action without ego. A reminder that sometimes the greatest leaders are those who carry the weight of history not on their shoulders, but in their hearts. The compromised President Rutherford B. Hayes. In 1876, the United States was still trying to catch its breath. The wounds of war hadn't fully healed. Reconstruction was faltering. And the presidency, that seat of national unity, stood at the edge of a cliff. Into this fragile moment stepped Rutherford B. Hayes, a quiet, thoughtful man from Ohio who had never sought the spotlight, yet suddenly found himself at the heart of a storm. The election was one of the closest in American history. Hayes, the Republican candidate, faced Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat. When the votes were counted, Tilden had clearly won the popular vote, and on paper, more electoral votes. But 20 of those electoral votes from several southern states were contested. Accusations of fraud and voter suppression flooded the headlines. There was no clear winner. To resolve the crisis, Congress created a special commission, 15 men, tasked with deciding who had truly won. After weeks of debate, the decision came down along party lines. Hayes was awarded the disputed votes, and with them the presidency, but it came at a price. Behind closed doors, an informal agreement had been made, what would become known as the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for securing the White House, Hayes and his allies agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. The deal quieted tensions. It averted violence. But it also left behind a bitter taste, especially for those who had fought for freedom and now felt abandoned. When Hayes took the oath of office, it was not in triumph. There were no crowds cheering in unity. Many Americans saw him not as a leader, but as a symbol of a backroom bargain. He had won, yes, but trust had been broken. Hayes, by nature, was honest and principled. But his presidency would begin with a shadow cast long before his first official act. He entered not with a mandate, but with a question. Could quiet integrity redeem a presidency born in controversy? Ending Reconstruction, the Compromise had spoken, and Hayes, true to his word, began the process of withdrawing federal troops from the South. For the first time since the Civil War, Southern states would govern without Northern oversight. To many white Southerners, it was a return to control. To many black citizens, it felt like a retreat, one that came too soon and too quietly. For 12 years after the Civil War, Reconstruction had tried to reshape the South. Freedmen's bureau schools had opened. Black men had voted and held office. Federal troops had acted as a shield against racial violence. But progress was fragile, always held together by political will and federal presence. When that presence vanished, so did much of the protection almost overnight. Southern states began imposing new laws, voter restrictions, segregation, intimidation. The era of redemption had begun, a euphemism for restoring white dominance. Black Americans, who had briefly glimpsed equality, now faced new obstacles to freedom. Poll taxes, literacy tests, threats of violence at the ballot box. Hayes had hoped that peace would bring fairness. He asked Southern leaders to respect civil rights, to uphold the Constitution. But without enforcement, hope became wishful thinking. Some historians argue that Hayes had little choice. The country was exhausted. Reconstruction had become politically unpopular in the North. The economy was still recovering from the panic of 1873. Many Americans simply wanted stability, even if that meant turning away from justice. Hayes did not act out of malice. But in choosing reconciliation over confrontation, his decision marked the end of a bold national effort to remake society. He believed the states could be trusted to heal themselves. But trust without accountability proved fragile. The South, freed from federal constraint, rewrote its own version of freedom, one that narrowed opportunity and deepened inequality. For decades, the consequences would echo in law, in culture, and in silence. Hayes would later reflect on his presidency with mixed emotions. He had kept his promises, but the results, especially for the people Reconstruction aimed to protect, left a legacy of regret. A quiet reformist, Rutherford B. Hayes never saw himself as a warrior. He was not a man of fiery speeches or sweeping agendas. Instead, he believed in quiet reform, slow, steady, and rooted in principle. Even as the controversy over his election loomed, Hayes remained focused on what he could change. At the top of his list was civil service reform. In an age when government jobs were handed out as rewards, Hayes believed in merit. He wanted to end the spoils system, the practice of trading positions for political loyalty. To him, public service should be honorable, not transactional. His efforts began modestly. He refused to fire federal workers for political reasons. He appointed reform-minded officials, and he clashed with party leaders who wanted patronage preserved. The battle was uphill and often thankless. But Hayes believed deeply in the dignity of honest work and in building a government that served the people, not parties. He also turned his attention to education, particularly in the South. He believed that education was the foundation of a healthy democracy, and he hoped that universal schooling might bridge the nation's divides. In speeches and policy proposals, he called for federal support of public education, regardless of race. But the public, weary from years of conflict and scandal, had grown tired of reform. Many Americans tuned out. Hayes's calm voice was often lost in the noise of louder politicians. His proposals found little traction. Congress resisted. The country had shifted from transformation to retreat, and yet Hayes did not waver. He spoke with clarity, even when few listened. He made decisions based on ethics, not applause. He stood firm in his refusal to use government positions as bargaining chips. Over time, his stance would inspire the next wave of reformers, leading eventually to the Pendleton Act and modern civil service protections. In the moment, though, his presidency felt quiet. It lacked drama, but also lacked recognition. His reforms were seeds, not monuments. But sometimes the quietest efforts endure longest. Hayes knew this. He did not expect glory. What he wanted was decency, a presidency that could be trusted, even if not celebrated. And in a time of fatigue and fading ideals, that quiet decency became its own kind of strength, healing or hesitation. Throughout his time in office, Hayes walked a narrow line between peace and progress, unity and accountability. His presidency asked a difficult question. When does seeking harmony become giving up the fight? In choosing to end Reconstruction, Hayes believed he was closing a chapter not in defeat, but in hope. He imagined a country that could heal without oversight, where former enemies might live as neighbors again. It was a dream of national unity, but dreams must be measured against reality. And in reality, withdrawing federal protection meant abandoning many who had only just begun to taste freedom. Hayes believed the Southern states would honor civil rights. Most did not. His choice, while made with good intentions, left many vulnerable. Was this healing? Or was it hesitation, a pause that lasted too long, allowing inequality to take root again? Hayes didn't always have easy answers. He was not a visionary. He was not a crusader. But he was thoughtful and often torn between competing values. Justice mattered to him. So did order. And in the balancing act of his presidency, he often leaned toward stability. Some praised him for restoring calm. Others criticized him for not pushing harder. In the end, he governed with restraint, and restraint, in moments of crisis, can feel like silence, yet Hayes did not ignore injustice. He spoke against racial violence. He condemned voter suppression. He tried in his way to hold the line. But without force behind his words, resistance often prevailed. His presidency became a mirror of the nation, hopeful but weary, idealistic but uncertain. And through it all, Hayes remained steady, not unmoved, but careful, not detached, but cautious. He did not chase history. He tried to hold it in place, and perhaps that is why his legacy feels so modest, not because he failed, but because he tried to pause a nation that was rushing forward, without always knowing where it was going. When his single term ended, Hayes did not run again. He had made a promise one term only, and he kept it. True to form, he stepped away quietly. No farewell parade. No hunger for more power. Just a return to private life, to reflection and simplicity. Back in Ohio, Hayes focused on education and prison reform. He supported scholarships for black students and served on the board of a university. He visited prisons, advocated for rehabilitation, and pushed for fairness in sentencing. These weren't the actions of a man chasing fame. They were the values of a man who still believed in better. He lived out his final years with grace. No scandals. No memoirs filled with bitterness. Just a quiet belief that public service was a duty, not a path to glory, but to good. History has rarely placed Hayes among the giants. His name doesn't stir strong emotions. His portrait doesn't hang in school hallways. But sometimes, legacy isn't measured by how loud it echoes, but by how gently it holds the line. Hayes's term marked a turning point. It closed the door on Reconstruction. It marked the nation's shift toward self-preservation over transformation. His presidency was not defined by bold leaps, but by careful steps, and in those steps there is something to remember. He was a man who kept his word, who led with conscience, who didn't chase popularity or bend to party pressure. He made mistakes, some with long shadows, but they were not made out of greed or pride. In a time when America might have fractured further, he helped it breathe. In a moment of confusion, he offered calm. And in stepping away, he reminded the country that leadership is not about holding on, but about letting go when the work is done. His legacy may be modest, but it is not empty. Sometimes modesty is a kind of strength. The Rough Riders' rise, Theodore Roosevelt, in September 1901. A bullet changed the course of history. President William McKinley was shot while attending a public event. Days later, he died from his wounds. And just like that, the United States had a new president, one younger, louder, and more restless than any who had come before. Theodore Roosevelt was only 42 years old when he took the oath of office. He became the youngest person to ever hold the presidency, not through election, but through tragedy. For some, it was a cause for concern. Roosevelt was known for his boldness, for charging into battles both literal and political. He was a cowboy, a war hero, a man who seemed to live twice as fast as anyone else, but behind the energy was a mind shaped by pain. As a boy, Roosevelt had been sickly and fragile. He struggled to breathe and spent years building up his strength. He read endlessly, filling his young mind with stories of heroism and adventure. When he grew, he didn't just recover, he transformed. Weakness became willpower. Illness became drive. And by the time he entered politics, he was unstoppable. Roosevelt had already served as a New York State Assemblyman, police commissioner, assistant secretary of the Navy, and governor of New York. He had also led the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry during the Spanish-American War, charging up San Juan Hill and into the national spotlight. He was elected vice president, not because people saw him as a leader, but because party bosses wanted him out of the way. Yet fate had other plans. When Roosevelt took over after McKinley's death, the country braced for the unknown. He brought energy to a capital that had grown slow. He walked through the White House halls like a man twice his size. His children played loudly in rooms once reserved for silence. His presence filled every space, not with ego, but with purpose. He did not wait for history to come to him. He ran toward it from the moment he stepped into office. Roosevelt believed the presidency wasn't just a job, it was a platform, a place to speak, to shape, to challenge. He called it the bully pulpit, and he used it to talk about fairness, not just in words, but in laws. His core belief was simple. Every American deserved a square deal that meant fairness for workers and employers, for businesses and consumers, for nature and industry. In a time when factories, polluted rivers, and corporations controlled entire towns, Roosevelt pushed for balance. He didn't see government as a bystander. He saw it as a referee, someone to blow the whistle when the game turned unfair. When coal miners went on strike in 1902, demanding better pay and safer conditions, Roosevelt didn't side with industry as presidents before him had. Instead, he brought both sides to the White House. He listened. He pressured. He found compromise. For the first time, the federal government stepped in, not against workers, but on their behalf. Roosevelt also believed in protecting the common good. He signed laws to regulate railroads, clean up the food supply, and make business dealings more transparent. He wasn't against wealth. He admired success. But he believed that with power came responsibility, and the government's job was to make sure that power served the people, not just the few. His square deal wasn't perfect, and it didn't solve every problem. But it sent a message. The presidency would no longer sit quietly while inequality spread. Under Roosevelt, the office gained a new voice, one that spoke with confidence, not caution, and Americans listened. Because they could feel it, the sense that someone was finally trying to level the field. Trustbuster and reformer, the early 1900s were a time of giants, not just in industry, but in influence. Huge corporations, known as trusts, controlled oil, steel, railroads, and more. They set prices, crushed competition, and bent laws to fit their needs. Many believed they were too big to challenge. Roosevelt believed otherwise. He earned the nickname Trust Buster, not because he hated business, but because he believed in fairness. He used the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law rarely enforced before, to take on some of the most powerful companies in the country. His first major target was the Northern Securities Company, a railroad trust led by J.P. Morgan and other tycoons. Roosevelt's administration sued to break it apart. The case went to the Supreme Court, and Roosevelt won. It shocked the business world. For the first time, the government had stood its ground against unchecked wealth and won. More suits followed. Roosevelt's actions didn't dismantle capitalism, but they reshaped its boundaries. He sent a clear message: size does not excuse abuse. Power must play by the rules, but his reforms didn't stop with business. He pushed for changes in the meatpacking industry after Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, revealed filthy, dangerous practices. Roosevelt read the book during lunch and put it down in disgust. Soon after, he signed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Labels became honest. Conditions improved. Roosevelt believed that government should act as a guardian, not to control every choice, but to protect public trust. His reforms laid the groundwork for future regulations. They opened the door to a more active, responsive federal role in everyday life. Not everyone agreed with him. Some said he went too far. Others said he didn't go far enough. But Roosevelt didn't govern for applause. He governed by principle. In doing so, he redefined what the presidency could be: not a passive observer, but a bold force for change, lover of wilderness. Long before he became president, Theodore Roosevelt fell in love with the wild. As a young man, he retreated to the Badlands of North Dakota after his wife and mother died on the same day. There, in the wide open spaces, he found healing. The harsh wind, the endless plains, the quiet strength of nature, they gave him back a sense of purpose that love never left him. As president, he made conservation a national mission. He believed that America's natural beauty, its forests, mountains, rivers, and wildlife, was not just a treasure, but a responsibility. It wasn't enough to enjoy nature. It had to be protected. Under his leadership, over 230 million acres of public land were conserved. He established 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and over 100 national forests. He created the U.S. Forest Service to manage these lands, not just for the present, but for generations to come. He said that conservation was about leaving the world better than we found it. That idea, so simple and yet so profound, became one of his lasting legacies. Roosevelt didn't see nature as something separate from progress. He believed they could coexist, that industry could thrive while respecting the earth. He built dams and irrigation systems to help farmers. But he also drew lines places that could not be touched because their beauty was beyond price. He took friends and diplomats on long hikes. He camped with naturalist John Muir in Yosemite. And he spoke of the Grand Canyon with calling it a place that should never be marred by development. For Roosevelt, the wilderness wasn't just land. It was a character. It was the story of America itself, vast, untamed, full of challenge and wonder. And it was worth protecting, not with chains, but with care. In his conservation work, Roosevelt planted something deeper than trees. He planted a sense of duty to protect, to preserve, and to pass on the wild as a gift, not a memory. When Roosevelt left the presidency in 1909, he did so with energy still burning inside him. He handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft, hoping his reforms would continue. But retirement did not suit Roosevelt. Action called, and he answered. First, he went to Africa not for politics, but for adventure. He led a scientific expedition that cataloged hundreds of species. He trekked through dense jungles and across sun-scorched plains. Then he explored the Amazon, almost dying from illness and exhaustion. He did not go to rest. He went to live, but even from afar, politics pulled at him. When he grew frustrated with Taft's direction, Roosevelt returned to run for president again, this time under a new party, the Progressive Bull Moose Party. He lost, splitting the vote and allowing Woodrow Wilson to win. Still, he remained a force, shaping public debate with every speech, every idea, every gesture. Even as age and injury caught up with him, Roosevelt never slowed. He wrote books. He campaigned for justice. He pushed for American strength abroad and moral strength at home. During World War I, he urged the nation to prepare and offered his own sons for service. One of them, Quentin, died in combat. Roosevelt grieved deeply, but spoke with pride. He never returned to the presidency. But in many ways, he never needed to. He had already expanded the role, remade its image, and left behind a blueprint for bold leadership. Roosevelt died in 1919 at the age of 60. His passing was quiet, unlike his life. A friend remarked that death had to take him in his sleep, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight. He left behind a country forever changed, more aware of its people, its power, and its wild places. He had made the presidency a pulpit, a compass, a lightning rod. And he had done it all with a fire that never dimmed. Roosevelt's story is not just one of ambition. It's a story of belief in the common man, in the natural world, and in the idea that action, guided by conscience, can shape a nation, a life larger than an office, and a spirit that still echoes like wind through the forests he saved. The fireside leader, Franklin D. Roosevelt. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office in March 1933, the United States was not simply in trouble, it was in crisis. The Great Depression had left deep scars. Banks had failed. Businesses had shuttered. Farms lay empty, blown dry by winds of dust. Families waited in long bread lines, unsure when their next meal might come. More than a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Desperation didn't whisper, it screamed, and yet, from the steps of the Capitol that cold spring day, Roosevelt's voice was steady. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he said, not as a boast, but as an invitation. To trust, to try again, to believe that the nation's spirit could survive its hardship. He was no stranger to struggle. Years earlier, polio had struck him, leaving his legs paralyzed. But he had refused to be defined by it. He had returned to public life with braces on his legs and fire in his voice. That personal fight became part of his appeal. He knew pain, but chose courage. Now, as the new president, he moved quickly. Bank holidays stopped panicked withdrawals. Emergency legislation poured through Congress. Roosevelt did not hesitate. He understood that action, bold, visible action, was necessary not just for the economy, but for the nation's faith. People didn't just want solutions. They needed a leader who seemed to understand, who didn't hide behind closed doors, who didn't speak in cold figures or empty promises. And Roosevelt, with his reassuring tone and confident smile, offered something rare in hard times. Calm as he settled into the White House, the country began to hold its breath a little less tightly. Slowly, signs of recovery emerged. And behind each policy, each speech, was a man who believed that government had not just the right, but the duty to help. In the depths of ruin, Franklin Roosevelt became a symbol of hope. Not because he solved everything overnight, but because he refused to stand still. The New Deal begins with the country still in pieces. Roosevelt unveiled a plan, not one program, but many a sweeping redefinition of what government could do. He called it the New Deal. At its heart was a belief that the federal government had a role in shaping economic life, in protecting the vulnerable, and in building a foundation strong enough to prevent collapse again. It wasn't about handouts. It was about building trust, dignity, and shared progress. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting trees and building trails. The Works Progress Administration built roads, schools, and libraries, not just to boost employment, but to enrich the fabric of everyday life. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity to forgotten places, lighting homes that had lived in darkness for generations. Banks were reformed. Wall Street was checked. Social Security was born, a promise that aging would not mean abandonment. Through hundreds of programs, Roosevelt reshaped the American relationship with its government. Not as a distant overseer, but as a partner in survival. Not everyone agreed. Critics on the right called it too much government. Those on the left said it wasn't enough. But Roosevelt, ever pragmatic, pressed forward. He welcomed debate. "I ask you to judge me by the enemies I have made," he once said with a smile. The New Deal didn't end the Depression by itself. Recovery was slow, and setbacks came often. But the programs brought work. They brought food. They brought dignity. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded the country that it was not abandoned. For Roosevelt, policy was not abstract. It was personal. He read letters from citizens, everyday stories of hunger, of fear, of quiet perseverance. And through the New Deal, he tried to answer them. What emerged was a new vision of the presidency, one that acted boldly, thought long-term, and spoke not just in laws, but in moral terms. Roosevelt didn't just lead. He restored belief that the future was worth working for, the voice in the living room in an era when radios sat at the center of homes. Roosevelt found a way to make the White House feel close, not in formality, but in warmth. He began broadcasting fireside chats, short radio addresses that cut through the noise of politics and spoke directly to the people. His voice was calm, measured, familiar. He explained complex problems in simple words. He told people what was being done and why. He didn't hide the challenges, but he didn't let fear rule the message. Each broadcast felt like a conversation between neighbors, not a decree from on high. Millions listened. Families gathered around radios, children hushed, parents leaning in. And in those quiet moments, the distant world of government felt less foreign. They weren't just hearing a president. They were hearing someone who understood them. It wasn't just the tone that mattered, it was the trust. Roosevelt's fireside chats built a bond between leader and people, one that didn't rely on spectacle. It relied on honesty. When banks reopened after his first chat, people returned their savings. When war loomed, they listened for guidance. These chats weren't flashy or political. They were grounding small anchors in uncertain times. In this way, Roosevelt redefined presidential communication. He didn't shout to be heard. He didn't grandstand. He met people where they were, in living rooms, kitchens, and quiet corners, and reminded them that they mattered. Even today, those chats remain a benchmark for connection. Not because of their polish, but because of their heart. Through a voice crackling over the radio, Roosevelt bridged the gap between fear and hope, one word at a time. War on the horizon. As the 1930s unfolded, storm clouds gathered overseas. In Europe, Adolf Hitler rose to power, fueling nationalism and fear. In Asia, Japan expanded aggressively across the Pacific. The world edged toward war once more. Roosevelt watched with concern. The United States, weary from the Great War and still recovering from depression, was deeply reluctant to get involved. Isolationist voices in Congress and the press warned against entanglements. Most Americans agreed, but Roosevelt saw the danger growing. He increased military funding quietly. He worked with allies behind the scenes. And all the while, he prepared the nation not through alarm, but through education. He reminded Americans of their values of freedom, of democracy, of shared responsibility. He knew that when the time came, the country would need to act not out of vengeance, but out of principle. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. In a single morning, the hesitation vanished. Battleships burned. Lives were lost. The illusion of distance was shattered. Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day. His words were deliberate, steady. He called it a date which will live in infamy, and war was declared. The nation, now united, began to mobilize. Factories shifted to weapons. Citizens rationed, volunteered, and prepared. Roosevelt, now a wartime president, led with the same calm urgency that had defined his response to the Depression. He worked closely with allies Britain, the Soviet Union, and others forming the backbone of what would become the Allied victory. His leadership wasn't loud, but it was constant through broadcasts, speeches, and letters. He reminded Americans that sacrifice had meaning, that unity had purpose, and that even in global darkness, light could be found in shared determination. He led not just with strategy, but with steadiness, the kind that turns uncertainty into resolve. The president who stayed Roosevelt's presidency was unlike any other. In 1940, as war loomed, he ran for an unprecedented third term. The nation, uncertain of the future, chose continuity over tradition. And then, in 1944, they did it again. 4 elections. 12 years. No president had ever served so long. But in Roosevelt, people saw not a king, but a keeper, someone who held the nation's story during its most fragile chapters. But the toll was visible. His health declined. The weight of war, of responsibility, showed in his eyes, his hands, his pace. Still, he carried on. Meetings with Churchill and Stalin. D-Day planning. United Nations talks. Even as his body weakened, his purpose never did. In April 1945, just weeks before the end of World War II in Europe, Roosevelt died at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. The news swept the world in silence. People wept in streets. Flags dropped to half-staff. Soldiers bowed their heads. He had led them through despair, through fear, through war. And now he was gone. His death marked the end of an era, one of struggle, resilience, and transformation. Under Roosevelt, the presidency had changed. The government had changed. The people had changed. His policies shaped the modern American state. His words shaped the American spirit. And his belief in collective action left a mark, not just on laws, but on hearts. Today, Roosevelt is remembered not just for what he did, but how he did it with warmth, with steadiness, and with faith. In the ordinary person's strength. In the darkness of depression, in the fire of war, he had stood firm. A president not of power alone, but of presence, and in his voice soft, strong, and enduring, a nation found its way forward. The young flame, John F. Kennedy, in January 1961, as snow dusted the nation's capital and the cold air clung to every breath. A new voice rose above the silence, young, confident, and filled with promise. John Fitzgerald Kennedy stood beneath the pale winter sky, raising his hand to take the oath of office as the 35th President of the United States. At just 43 years old, he was the youngest elected president in the country's history. He spoke with a rhythm that stirred the soul. Ask not what your country can do, for you ask what you can do for your country, with that single line. A generational shift was complete. The long shadow of World War II began to give way to something different, a new age of possibility. Kennedy's presence alone felt like movement. His easy smile, crisp suits, and elegant posture reflected. More than style, they mirrored a deeper mood sweeping through the nation. Americans tired of caution were ready to dream again. They wanted courage. They wanted progress. And in Kennedy, they saw a reflection of their best hopes. He was not untouched by hardship. As a child, he battled illness and fragility. As a soldier in World War II, he faced death in the waters of the Pacific. These early trials shaped his character, quiet resilience beneath public charm. When he stepped into the presidency, the world was changing fast. The civil rights movement stirred. Space called from above. The Cold War simmered with tension. And yet, Kennedy embraced it all not with fear, but with a restless drive to move forward. He invited the nation to aim higher, to explore, to ask questions, to believe again. His speeches weren't just policy. They were poetry for a weary people. And his youth was not a weakness, it was a flame, lighting a new path into a restless century. Cold War tensions yet, even as Kennedy's message soared with hope, the world outside bristled with danger. The Cold War, a global struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, was never far from crisis. And during Kennedy's presidency, it came closer to the edge than ever before. In 1961, just months after taking office, Kennedy faced a humiliation, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. A group of Cuban exiles, trained and supported by the U.S., attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro. The mission collapsed. International trust faltered. And Kennedy, newly minted as president, stood before the world with blame resting squarely on his shoulders. But the greatest test was still to come. In October 1962, U.S. intelligence discovered Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American coast. What followed became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days of steady nerves, where one wrong move could have ignited nuclear war. Kennedy chose caution over aggression. He ordered a naval blockade. Calling it a quarantine, behind the scenes, he sent messages to Moscow, looking for a peaceful way out. The world held its breath. Eventually, a deal was struck. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles. In return, the U.S. would secretly agree to remove its own missiles from Turkey. A catastrophe had been avoided not with bombs, but with patience. Kennedy's strength during those days wasn't about military might. It was about knowing when to wait, when to speak, when to bend without breaking. He also traveled to Berlin, where the Cold War had cut a city in half. There, in front of a crowd yearning for unity, he spoke the words, "Ich bin ein Berliner." It was a simple phrase yet powerful in its solidarity. Kennedy didn't just lead from Washington. He stood where the world was most divided and dared to offer hope. Civil rights awakening while Kennedy wrestled with threats abroad, pressure mounted at home. The civil rights movement was no longer a quiet call. It had become a rising tide. Across the South, Black Americans marched, sat in, and stood up demanding an end to segregation, inequality, and injustice. 81st, Kennedy moved carefully. He had won the presidency by a narrow margin. Many of his supporters came from states resistant to change. And yet, the images coming from the streets of peaceful protesters beaten, jailed, denied the vote could not be ignored. Kennedy began to shift. Quiet concern turned to public recognition. When James Meredith was blocked from enrolling at the University of Mississippi, Kennedy sent federal marshals to protect him. When Martin Luther King, Jr.B., was imprisoned in Georgia, Kennedy made a call that helped secure his release, a small act, but one that echoed through history. By 1963, his voice grew firmer. In a televised address to the nation, Kennedy spoke, not just as a politician, but as a human being. "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue," he said, calling for legislation to guarantee equal rights for all Americans. It was the beginning of what would become the Civil Rights Act. He had not always led on the issue, but when he did speak, he made it clear equality was no longer just a question of politics. It was a test of the nation's soul. In private, he worried that the country might fracture. But in public, he stood taller with each passing month, not only because it was politically necessary, but because the time for silence had ended. Kennedy didn't live to see the Civil Rights Act signed. That would fall to his successor. But the seeds he planted in word and deed helped push the movement from hope into law, and in doing so, he joined a deeper story, one not just of presidents, but of people rising to claim their rights. They had always deserved the dream of Camelot beyond politics, beyond speeches and crises. Kennedy's presidency shimmered with something harder to define, a sense of wonder, of elegance, of youth transformed into leadership. The White House, once seen as formal and reserved, began to feel alive. His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, restored its rooms with historical beauty, inviting artists, poets, and thinkers into its halls. Television specials gave Americans a glimpse of their national home, not as a fortress, but as a living museum of culture and hope. Children played on the South Lawn. Music filled state dinners. Foreign leaders were greeted not with cold protocol, but with warmth and charm. The Kennedy years became known as Camelot, a reference to the legendary court of King Arthur, where justice, beauty, and idealism once ruled. It wasn't just about glamour. It was about vision. Kennedy spoke of going to the moon not because it was easy, but because it was hard. He believed in space exploration, science, and the idea that American progress should stretch beyond Earth itself. He invited citizens to service. He created the Peace Corps, sending young Americans across the world to teach, build, and connect. His belief in public duty was contagious. Even his flaws, and there were many, seemed touched by complexity. His health was poor, far worse than the public knew. He suffered from chronic pain, hidden behind a confident walk and bright smile. Yet he carried that weight without complaint, always moving forward, always trying to inspire. Camelot was not a policy. It was a feeling, a sense that the presidency could be more than power, that it could be poetry, and for a brief time, that dream felt real. On November 22, 1963, the dream was broken. In Dallas, Texas, as Kennedy rode through the streets in an open car, shots rang out. He was struck, and the world seemed to stop. The president died shortly after. The news spread like a storm. Radios, televisions, phone calls, tears. Schools went quiet. Churches opened their doors. Strangers embraced in the streets. A young son saluted his father's casket. A widow stood draped in grief and grace. The flame at his grave, now eternal, flickered in the wind. The country had not only lost a leader, it had lost a sense of possibility. The what if would linger for generations. What if he had lived to see the moon landing? To pass stronger civil rights laws? To finish what he began? In death, Kennedy became more than a man. He became a symbol of youth cut short, of a dream interrupted. His image would remain etched in memory. The wind in his hair, the promise in his voice, the weight of a future he would never reach, but his legacy endured not just in buildings or programs, but in a national spirit stirred awake. His words still echo. His vision still inspires. In the end, John F. Kennedy reminded a restless country that leadership could be noble. that politics could reach the heart, that history, even, when brief, could burn bright, and though the flame was taken too soon, its warmth never fully faded.